Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish Podcast. I am Rebecca, and I am joined by my co-host, Landon. How are you, Landon?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am fantastic, and you are out of the country at an underground bunker. Is that right?
No underground bunker, no.
I know everyone's like, where's Brandon? They still ask that. I'm like, if you're
Yeah.
talking about Landon, it's a trip, right? But we are super excited that you're joining us today, and everyone will figure out why, because this is a very pivotal, important podcast. And you will know this because look who else is on the screen, Dr. John Lundwall. Oh my gosh, Dr. John, how are you?
It's good to be back. It's good to see Brandon and your lovely,
Yeah.
wonderful, smiling face, Rebecca, and a friend of mine who actually was an old time missionary companion of mine.
This is what's so exciting. We have a very special guest today. We have Patrick, who we kind of connected with through Dr. John, because I don't always answer every email or text I get. But when someone says, hey, I'm an old friend of Dr. John's, I'm like, okay, I think you're probably okay. So we'd like to welcome Patrick to the show. How are you today, Patrick?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
So now explain this to me, you guys. You guys were mission companions. Tell us a little bit about that.
Go for it, Patrick.
No, you go ahead. I'll be doing most of the talking, John.
And this is true.
We were we served in British Columbia in the 80s when the church was true.
Yeah, it was true in the end. You're right.
And we were British Columbia is a huge province. It's the land size of Washington, Oregon, California put together. So we were traveling APs. The mission gave us a car, and we drove hundreds and hundreds of miles through the province, visiting different elders that lived far, far away from the mission home. Sometimes, you'd send them 500 miles away, and then, we would show up 3 months later, and they had converted to a different religion and had married 3 different women. So, yeah, you had to try to keep tabs on them. So we were traveling APs together, and I have to say that was one of the highlights of my mission. Both the travel, I mean, the British Columbia is such a gorgeous, gorgeous province, but also Patrick was just full of fun. Within 5 minutes of getting in the car with Patrick as a brand new companion, he said, "Oh wait, we got to do something." And he takes the fuse out of one part of the car and puts it into the radio so that we could listen to tunes as we drove.
Oh.
And I was like, I like this guy.
Yeah, because missionaries, you're not really supposed to have that type of music, right?
We listened only to the Mormon Tabernacle channel in northern Canada. You didn't know that channel existed.
Unfortunately, I'm guessing that you couldn't pick it up. Yeah.
No. Wow. Yeah. Well, a technical genius is a good person to have as a companion. That is so funny. So you were basically kind of like, I don't know, looking for proof of life from these elders and also checking to make sure that they were still following those mission rules, even though living remotely. Is that right?
We followed most of the rules, don't you think, Patrick?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think 100%, but pretty close. I mean, we were pretty orthodox, I think.
Yeah.
We were high tier terrestrial.
There you go. And you were APs. I mean, were you an AP, Landon? I can't remember.
Oh no.
Yeah, he's like, oh no. Landon was a rebel.
Make that mistake.
Yeah. No, Landon you wouldn't know it to look at him, but he was a rebel.
It doesn't even take revelation to know that shouldn't happen.
Well, you know what? You're an AP here on Mormonish, and that's an absolutely fantastic podcaster. Or awesome podcaster, right? You're an AP here. So.
Well, when you told me that Patrick was coming on, I was kind of excited because it's great to spend some time with an old friend. So Patrick, had a great time on my mission with you. Here we are on a podcast, an ex-Mormon podcast together.
Yeah, it's
so scandalous.
Right? What's happened? What happened in British Columbia when the APs are leaving?
That's right. Ending up here on this podcast.
Stays in BC, Brandon.
Yeah.
That's so funny. All right. Well, that's really fun. And I'm excited. You know, the topic of the podcast is not reuniting Patrick and John, although that's really fun.
Oh, wait, it isn't? What am I doing here?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not. That's right. Go back to bed. We're taping this pretty early. All of us have our coffee. We look a little bleary, except for Patrick, who's right up. We're like, okay. So bear with us, everybody. But I'm excited to have a panel like this. This is always really fun. So, and especially this topic. So Patrick has been doing some really, really interesting research, and it may sound a little familiar because he has kind of semi-presented this other places in sort of a more informal way. But, you know, when Landon and I had dinner with Patrick just to kind of talk about what he's been working on, we're like, you know what, we need to number one, put slides together, right? That's what I always say. You got to put some slides together. And we really need to get this out there because it's really fascinating. And it's also something that's kind of in line of things that Dr. John's been working on and talking about. So that's why we kind of brought everybody together. So let us share screen, Patrick, if that's possible, and we will dive into this absolutely fascinating topic that I think all of us have kind of been talking a little bit about, you know, over the last couple of years. But you have some really innovative things to talk about. So take it away, Patrick, and, you know, we'll do the presentation. We can stop and ask questions as we go along, but I think this is going to be really fascinating. And thank you for bringing this to Mormonish. We're really excited.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to go through some of this information, and it's a lot of fun. You know, I watch a lot of Mormon themed podcasts, and Mormonish is one of my favorites, and so it's always felt like you're, you know, somebody I know. So it was really fun to have dinner and get to actually know you in person, and then have John on. That's really special. And I second everything John said about the mission. It was a beautiful place. And a lot of fun to travel up into the kind of the northern part of the country. Most of the people live right by the border, so it's fun to kind of get up into the wild northern parts of the province. And okay, so you can see on the slides here that I'm not bearing the lead. I'm putting it right up there.
You're not teasing us, right? You're just saying, this is what we're talking about. Here it is.
Yeah, pulling the conclusion forward. So it's Sidney Rigdon, the founder of Mormonism and the primary author of the Book of Mormon. So here you've got the known unknown, which is the Book of Mormon authorship, which a lot of people are talking about, and talking about it within the frame of Joseph. You know, it's either Joseph was inspired of God or Joseph made it up. The unknown is Sidney Rigdon and the founding. I don't think anybody really talks or thinks about the founding of Mormonism. And when I started researching this topic, it was Book of Mormon authorship. And the founding portion of this came along with it once I started learning more about Sidney Rigdon. All right, let me try and advance the slides here.
Yeah, I think you know, I've heard this you know, thrown around by different people, and I know that there's, you know, several problems that people say, you know, that Sidney Rigdon didn't even appear on the scene until after the Book of Mormon was already produced and stuff. So I'm very interested to see, you know, what your approach is and what you think happened, or how you came to whatever conclusion it is that you're going to present.
Okay, can you see the second slide?
Yep, we can see analytical approach.
Okay, yeah, it took a second to to move forward. So the first thing we're going to do, sorry, it's not trying to figure out how to make it move.
Arrows, that's what I always look for.
Yeah,
a little complicated.
I'm glad I'm not the only one with technical difficulties.
Yeah, no, I know. There we go.
Okay. All right. So John gave a little bit of introduction to the fact that, you know, we served together in the mission. So one thing I do want to mention is just the different types of information that we're going to be talking about, because I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Patrick, as we've said, and because the evidence deals with textual analysis and wordprint studies, I'll just mention that I did get an undergraduate degree in accounting and a master's, an MBA. And so I have taken a couple statistics courses. I'm certainly not excellent in statistics, and it's been a long time since I took those courses, but I have a basic comfort level with the data, and and so that's relevant when we get into the wordprint studies, especially that that I'm familiar with data, and data is actually in my job title at work. So I have kind of an analytical mind. I love science. I love travel. I love learning about the world and its wonders. And so that's kind of a little bit about what has led us to this point where I'm going to be talking about this topic. I want to mention that this is not an attack on faith. This is really just, we're going to take 2 hours or so to kind of roll through the data. One of my heroes is Dan McClellan, who has a podcast called Data Over Dogma. And that basically means you try to put aside your dogma, the things that you, the narratives or the way that you think, basically, and just look at the data and try and analyze it through its own lens and try to make the most reasonable interpretation of anything that you're looking at. So again, it's not trying to take anyone's faith away. If you love Mormonism, that's great. This will be a critical side approach, not a faithful approach. But again, that's not the point. The point is to look at the data. And I encourage feedback, corrections, updates. A year ago, I didn't know anything more than anybody else knew about Sidney Rigdon. I knew 2 things. In the last year, I've asked friends and family, what do you know about Sidney Rigdon? And they'll say 2 or 3 things that they know about Sidney Rigdon. And so I'm not an expert in it, but I've done a lot of research in the last year. And again, I'm not an expert in wordprint science. So hopefully somebody will see this, and somebody with more expertise in this area that can provide more information and kind of move this topic forward. I document religiously. I will say that when I first met with Rebecca and Landon, and they said, make slides. I had a Word document at that point, and they said, make slides. And I made 7 different presentations. So
I remember receiving that email and thinking, okay, yes, we can talk about this going forward. Let's do one to begin with.
Yeah, let's do one. So one thing that I had to leave behind was all of the citations. Other than the wordprint studies, I have a link to each of those studies. But most of the information is pretty well known amongst the community here, I think. And if we have follow-up questions, I'm happy to address those. I don't think I'm introducing data that you couldn't just Google right off of the bullet point and find it online. So I just want to know it's true and then make it available. And I think this information is correct, and I think the analysis is reasonable. So Joseph Smith told Isaac Galland, Mormonism is truth. The first and fundamental principle of our holy religion is that we believe we have a right to embrace all and every item of truth without limitation. And J. Reuben Clark, who's the BYU Law School is named after, if we have truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. If we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed. So that's one thing I've always loved in Mormonism, is the claim that we follow the truth. And sometimes that's difficult, but that's kind of my guiding light in this, is just to go after what I think is true. All right, so right up front, I'll just quickly show you information when you're doing this kind of research comes from faithful sources. You've got the Joseph Smith Papers online database. You've got all kinds of biographies, including excellent biographies of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. You've got various podcasts. Mormonism with the Murph has had Dan Vogel on and other experts. And so what's interesting is that people who don't have an expertise in history can actually go and access all this information online or buy those biographies and other books. So it's really quite accessible. The critical sources, you've got an additional biography of Sidney Rigdon from William Whitsitt. Of course, Dan Vogel is probably the preeminent Mormon scholar. LDS Discussions on Mormon Stories had several episodes on the Book of Mormon and how it was put together. And I've got podcasts. We've got, Ganesh Cherian has been on Mormonish quite a bit, and other interesting people. John Lundwall, I think, has the #1 podcast on Mormonish. He's got a PhD in a particular subject. I don't want to spoil the topic too much, but I would encourage everybody to go to Mormonish, go to the homepage. The very first thing you're going to see is Dr. Lundwall's presentations, and go to the first one and then just go through them all. They're very, very interesting. And John actually has an expertise in that topic, so, unlike me on this one. And then we have Mormon discussions and some of the other interesting areas. So what are the theories of Book of Mormon authorship? And this is one of the most important slides. This is the most important slide, and there's 5 or 6 of the most important slides. Really understanding what our options are is critical to the question. And so the church's claim, the faithful claim, is that the Book of Mormon is ancient scripture from the Americas, written on golden plates, delivered to Joseph by an angel, and then translated to English by the gift and power of God. That's how Joseph described it. The counterclaim is that, let me move this out. The counterclaim is that to believe this, you have to believe in the supernatural. So if you're not inclined to believing in the supernatural, then it's going to be tough for you to believe this one. The Book of Mormon contains a lot of 19th century material. So its claim is that it's ancient scripture, but there's a lot of material from the 19th century. There's anachronisms, including the ones that John presents. There's lack of archaeological evidence, and the DNA population studies that have been done contradict the narrative. The original critical claim, so when the Book of Mormon showed up on the ground, the people that didn't believe it, they didn't really know what to think in the first 6 months. 6 months after the Book of Mormon was published, Sidney Rigdon shows up on the scene. And people pretty much looked at Joseph and Sidney, and they're like, yeah, that guy did it. So Sidney was flagged from the beginning. And so the original critical claim is that Sidney Rigdon, let me fill out the rest of that. So the Spalding part of the Spalding-Rigdon theory came along about a year and a half or 2 years later. Missionaries were reading from the Book of Mormon in a town where Spalding had lived, and people that were familiar with Spalding and a manuscript they claimed he had resembled the Book of Mormon. And so the theory is that Sidney Rigdon obtained the manuscript, which had the narrative part of the Book of Mormon. That the people said it wasn't religious; it was just a narrative part. Spalding was nearing his death, so he was concerned about his wife and his daughter, and so he left the manuscript, according to this theory, at a print shop. And it just so happens to be that that print shop was in a town in Pittsburgh where Sidney Rigdon also lived. So that was not known at the time. So that's kind of an interesting connection. So Sidney added the religious sermons. So if you're familiar with the Book of Mormon, you know there's this narrative of people traveling and having wars and building cities, and then interspersed are these lovely sermons that show up in the text. And so the theory is that Rigdon added all those sermons, and then he gave the text to Joseph Smith in some fashion, and Joseph dictated it then to Oliver Cowdery. The counterclaim is that the evidence for each portion of the theory can be disputed. There's a gentleman, I ran into his podcast just a couple weeks ago, Spalding Rigdon podcast. His name is Kurt Arman, and I texted him to see if there was a piece of evidence that I wanted more information on, and so I went to look him up. He was actually a friend of yours, John, so I don't know if you know Kurt Arman. But it took 4 hours for him to go through all of the evidence. So there's a lot of evidence for the Spalding-Rigdon theory. It's just that you can dispute any of it if you want to. And then finally, and I should say that was the claim until 1945 when Fawn Brodie wrote No Man Knows My History, a biography of Joseph Smith. And she personally didn't think that Spalding and Rigdon theory had a lot of evidence. And so she proposed the sole author theory, which is that Joseph created the text by himself. The counterclaim here is that Joseph had only a common education. He showed no intent or preparation to compose a book, especially one that contained complex narrative and theological content. So let me just pause, and I don't want to strawman the theories up front. So do these seem reasonable? Is there stronger counterclaims on any of these points that you would think?
No, these are all mainstream theories as to the Book of Mormon. The Rigdon Spalding theory is still on the table for a lot of people. And the counterclaim, you've listed them out perfectly, Patrick.
Okay, great. Sometimes when you're in a tunnel, researching by
A
yourself,
silo. That's right. Were you
a
going to say something,
silo.
Landon?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I've gone back and forth on these. I've looked at the evidence on all the different ones. The thing that stood out to me most that supported the Spalding-Rigdon theory is the fact that, here's Sidney Rigdon. He's older than Joseph. He's more accomplished. He was a well-known preacher. He had his own congregation, and here Joseph, the Book of Mormon comes out, and literally within 6 months, the Book of Mormon is in Rigdon's congregation, and his entire congregation is converted to Mormonism, and Joseph is now living in Kirtland, Ohio, and they basically the churches basically exist because Rigdon's congregation accepted it and took over. That seems a little strange that an entire congregation would convert that quickly to something like this. I guess the counterclaim to that would be, why if Rigdon wrote it, would he not take credit for it, or at least be the second fiddle to Joseph? Because Sidney was clearly much more accomplished at the time than Joseph, and it would seem that he would take the lead. But then when we go to counter evidence again, you say Joseph got rid of everybody in his circle. Everyone that wasn't a family member, he excommunicated. But Sidney Rigdon was with him all along. He never got rid of Sidney Rigdon, no matter what happened, which makes you think, oh, he relied on Sidney Rigdon very heavily, doing things that I don't think he could do himself. So I go back and forth on him because there's counterclaims on both sides that I can see. So
I'll just put in, I'm highly critical of the Rigdon Spalding theory for the Book of Mormon. However, just as you mentioned, Landon, uh, there are really compelling pieces around Rigdon, and the fact that he's the number two man throughout the entire history of the church is, that's very interesting. So I'm excited to see what Patrick has for us.
Yeah. Well, that calls to mind something, John. The phrase "big claims require big evidence" or strong, something to that effect. I'm very sensitive to the fact that it's a pretty big claim, so hopefully the evidence is up to it. I like to joke around and have fun, and I like sarcasm. So I thought of a couple points of humor. Let me just try this one out. So between the second and the third claim, what is the main difference between those two claims?
I would say divine origin. The first one, it's all divine origin.
well, he said between the second and third.
Oh, second and third, not first and second.
It'd be authorship.
Yeah, what's the main difference? Well, the answer to me is everybody that actually knew Joseph Smith were in the second bucket.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Nobody that knew Joseph Smith is in the third bucket. Okay. All right, here we go. So how did the project start? I saw this LDS Scripture Central video that talked about voice diversity. And this is part of the latest wordprint study from 2018. And the wordprint study basically shows you that they presented in a different format, but I later found this chart that had the hard numbers on the difference between the Book of Mormon and four contemporary authors that we all know and love, hopefully. And the results show that the Book of Mormon has 2 to 3 times the diversity of these great authors who, were known for writing. And Joseph, I don't think had even written a very long letter before the Book of Mormon was dictated. So 2 to 3 times, that just seems really amazing that, you look at Cooper and then Cooper's like,
And what we're talking about for people that are listening, not watching, is voice diversity. Why don't you kind of explain what that is? And we can see on the graph that, Book of Mormon's way off the chart compared to the other authors we're talking about.
Right. So the word print basically will, everybody has a word print. Everybody speaks differently in the way they phrase things and the way they characterize things. And so when you look at the common words that we all use, they're very difficult to manipulate. But what these authors are all trying to do is to create different characters who speak differently and have a different character, different feel to how their voice is represented in the text. And so you have diversity amongst all the different characters that are in your books. And so they can graphically score how much diversity is in the book. So you can see that Dickens, creates more diversity in the word print in his books than Cooper does, but Joseph Smith does even better than Dickens by a significant portion. So I thought that was really weird.
First time in church history we've seen diversity actually exist. So
good one, Landon.
yeah, that's probably true. So I thought that was really weird because everybody's got the Joseph glasses on and they see everything through the filter of the faithful narrative, where there should be a lot more authors than 2 or 3. There should be 6, 7, 8 primary authors and 24 secondary authors that would have some sort of word print that shows up. And for the sole author view, there should only be one author. It should look like one author. So I was looking at this confused, like what does this all mean? And so I started researching, and I next went to a response video from Mormonism Live. And this is Bill Reel and RFM's Radio Free Mormons podcast. And when I went to get a screen grab, I realized that, Rebecca, you were actually on that episode as well.
I was on that episode. I'm everywhere.
Yes, that's
Brandon's so nowhere to be seen, though.
No.
So that in that video, Bill Reel spent a fair amount of time going through a Wheat and Tares article that Rob Terry had posted that explains the 3-voice framework. He calls it the NSL framework, for the narrator voice, the sermon voice, and the late voice. So if you read the Book of Mormon, there's clearly narration, there's clearly all these sermons. He's a data analyst and he discovered a late voice, so he calls it the NSL. To me, it's a little easier to think of it in terms of a 3-voice framework. So basically, I'm looking at 2 or 3 different videos and they're all pointing to 2 or 3 authors. And so I'm like, what does this mean? So I started doing some research, and
can I interject? Can I interject?
Yeah.
These word print studies can prove different voices. They cannot prove different authors. Right? And one author can produce different voices, or multiple authors can produce different voices. You can study different voice patterns, but that does not necessarily mean it's different authors. Comment, Patrick?
I would say that's the entire effort of wordprint science, is to try to tease out the difference between multiple characters and multiple authorship. And so we'll dive into that deeply when we get into the wordprint section, for sure. All right. So if there's multiple authors, who are the candidates? And I had actually gone and listened to a 3-part episode that Bill Reel and Radio Free Mormon did, and Dan Vogel and Bryce Blankenagel were on. And as we talked about, there is a lot of information about the theory. I left that 3-part episode thinking, wow, there's a lot of really curious, compelling information, but it wasn't enough for me to think, I need to kind of change my paradigm. So I basically just went on with life after that 3-part episode. So the first potential candidate is Joseph Smith, who dictated the entire Book of Mormon. He put his hat and his seer stone that he used for treasure digging in a hat, and he dictated the Book of Mormon to Oliver Cowdery. So he's kind of a secondary candidate. He was a primary scribe. He had other scribes that dictated the first 116 pages, and then it was lost. And so Cowdery came in and did the rest of the Book of Mormon, other than a little bit of secondary scribing, but for the most part, he was the scribe. He was a blacksmith by trade. He had just become school teacher.
What was that?
Did you lose the audio, John?
Can you hear any of us?
Yeah, I think
I can hear all of you.
Yeah, I can hear you, Patrick.
I can.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going, or?
Yeah, no, keep going. It's probably me.
Ah.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to duck out and come back? Let's see. I'll make a note. It's 9:27. They'll just cut that out. So start again with Oliver. Well, but John, we want you to be able to hear. Can you hear?
I can hear now. I think I just had an internet glitch.
Little glitch. Okay, start again with say he's a blacksmith. Start there.
Okay. And Oliver Cowdery was a blacksmith by trade. He became a school teacher. He was about Joseph's age, so he was quite young when he showed up. He was in his early 20s. And he got a job teaching in the Palmyra, Manchester, New York area where the Smiths were. And so he became the scribe. And you'll discover there's a lot of connections. It's a small world in Mormonism back then. He was a distant cousin of the Smith family. Next, we have Sidney Rigdon. He was a Campbellite minister when he joined the church. He had a theology similar to the Book of Mormon. He immediately became the co-leader of the church, which is something that I had no idea. And he authored a lot of the doctrine. Solomon Spaulding is a candidate for the narrative part of the Book of Mormon. He had a master's degree from a linguist, noted linguist in ancient languages from the Moores Indian Charity School at Dartmouth College. And he wrote at least 2 manuscripts that we know about. And if he wrote the Book of Mormon narrative manuscript, then he had 3. His other manuscripts have similar narratives to the Book of Mormon narrative. And people called him Old Come to Pass, as I mentioned. I'm going to put up Ethan Smith and authors like Ethan Smith. There were a lot of people in this day and time that were talking about the narrative in the same terms, had the same ideas. You had the mound builder myth that some civilizations had to have come from the old world to the new world because these great civilizations they're evident by the mounds couldn't have been built by the Native Americans. And here his connections are, he was the minister in Vermont of the Cowdery family. And he was also a classmate at Dartmouth with Spaulding. And Joseph Smith's brother Hiram went to Dartmouth as well, to the same school. So a lot of connections. So why consider the founding of Mormonism? Why is this important that I bring 2 topics here? My research showed that Rigdon's role was very important. And so I thought, why did I know nothing about Mormonism, living in Mormonism all my life? Turns out Brigham Young. After the death of Joseph Smith, there was a struggle to take over the movement. The 2 main people that were fighting for this were Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon was Joseph's co-equal, basically, for the last 14 years. Brigham was the head of the apostles, and he made the case and won out. And after that point, Rigdon went on to start his own church. And remember, at this point in time, the Spaulding-Rigdon theory was the main critical theory. So everybody that wasn't in Mormonism believed that Sidney had basically written the Book of Mormon. So it was in Brigham's interest to write Rigdon out of the history. And he did that almost 100% effectively. I think determining that who was the founder would inform Book of Mormon authorship. And there's more discussion to come. But basically, if we think Joseph had the capability to do everything in Mormonism, as far as the ideas and the structure and the practices and rituals, then it doesn't seem as big a leap to think that he wrote the Book of Mormon. But if Sidney Rigdon founded Mormonism, and the ideas came from him, and Joseph was simply kind of a mouthpiece and the charismatic leader who managed relationships and things like that, then it seems like, I think, a little bit bigger leap. And so I think it informs the way you look at the authorship of the Book of Mormon question. So I think the 2 are linked together. And because the Book of Mormon claims basically the Mormon movement within it. And we'll talk a lot more about that as well. So what is a founder? The dictionary says a founder has a lasting impact on the beliefs, practices, and organization of their respective movements. So think about who came up with the ideas, basically, who came up with the doctrine, who came up with the ritual and the practices and the organizational structure. So I'm going to compare this to the founding of the United States, because when we think about the leader of the United States, Rebecca, who do you think is the first leader of the United States?
Well, of course, you always learn it's George Washington, like the picture just showed, right?
Okay.
Yep, there you go.
So, yeah, who do we think of as the founder? Who came up with the ideas? Who created the structure? Do we think George Washington came up with the structure?
Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a family member who teaches American government at the college level, and so there's some good candidates here between Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, and that person told me I'd go with Madison actually as the founder. But again, we say founding fathers because there's a lot, right? And so when we think about who was putting the Constitution together, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who had all these ideas of democracy and the republic, it wasn't George Washington. We don't talk in terms of George Washington being the founder. We think of him as the first leader, the first president. And so when we think about Mormonism, of course, Joseph is the leader for sure. Charismatic, he could convince people of what his claims were, and even through difficult struggles, he was able to keep things together. So he was a really, really skilled leader. And again, the whole thesis here is that the founder is actually Sidney Rigdon. So determining authorship of the 12 Federalist Papers. There were 12 Federalist Papers whose authorship was unknown, and wordprint was used to determine the authorship of those unknown. And guess what? They didn't use Washington in the short list. They had Madison and Jay and Hamilton. And so in a similar fashion, we'll have a wordprint study that has a short list of potential authors as well. All right, so what is my theory? It's not the Spalding-Rigdon theory exactly. It's pretty close. Based on all the data that we're going to discuss today, this is my conclusion. Sidney Rigdon obtained the narrative text from someone like Solomon Spalding. He added the sermon text and engaged Joseph to produce the Book of Mormon in a miraculous manner. And when the first 116 pages were lost, Joseph helped craft the replacement text. So he contributed to a lesser portion of the Book of Mormon text. So the wordprint studies and the textual analysis should be seeing a narrative author, Sidney Rigdon, and Joseph Smith in the text. I think it's not unreasonable to think that the founder is also the likely author of the Book of Mormon. And I think Spalding is as good a candidate as any, but most of the focus is going to move forward and look at Rigdon. Spalding died in 1816, which is 12 years before the Book of Mormon was dictated. So he's kind of not even on the scene at that point. All right, so I mentioned earlier, excuse me, that I'd originally put together numerous presentations. So each of the sections here is going to basically be one of those presentations. So does Rob Terry's three-voice framework establish three authors? So really understanding how the Book of Mormon comes to us. What does it look like? How does it present itself? Secondly, we'll dive into the wordprint studies. Third, we're going to look at textual clues in the book itself to see if they point to Rigdon and Smith in the late voice. Did Joseph have the capability to write the entire Book of Mormon? Who's Sidney Rigdon? Since we know two or three things about Sidney, those that haven't really dug into this theory very much. And then finally, is Joseph or Sidney the more likely candidate for Book of Mormon authorship and the founding of Mormonism? All right, so section 1, three-voice framework. This structure really is important to frame all of the textual analysis and also the wordprint studies too. And so we're gonna spend a little bit of time in class here learning about it. Rob Terry is a data scientist. He took the BYU Book of Mormon Voices database and he created his framework. And he also, in this article, summarized 5 of the 7 wordprint studies. So that's where I first started becoming a little bit familiar with the wordprint studies. And unfortunately for Rob, the very most important study that did exactly what he wanted to do was not known to him. And it's because nobody's talked about it. And you can only find it online if you hit the archive of BYU. Before we get into his framework, we're going to talk about the dictation order because it's a narrative voice, a sermon voice, and a late voice. And so we have to understand which order the books were dictated. And so we'll get into that. We'll see how the framework shows up in the data and also in some graphs so that you can help visualize what we're talking about. And we'll talk about how the narrator voice and the sermon voice switch and alternate between the two. And then we'll see some graphs on the late voice. And then what are we going to take away? What are the important points that we're going to use to frame the rest of the analysis? So for example, if there are multiple authors, then every piece of data should be framed within its corresponding voice. So if we see Joseph Smith or things that look like they're coming from the Smith family in the Book of Mormon, we need to understand whether it's in the place that we expect it to be, which is in the late voice. If it shows up in the narrator or the sermon voice, then that would be evidence against the claim. So the dictation order of the Book of Mormon was established by Brent Metcalf about 20 years ago. He discovered that the published order of the book, if you open it up and just read from beginning to end, it's not the same as the dictated order. This is called the Mosiah priority because when they lost the first 116 pages, they were in Mosiah. They didn't start over again. They started back with Mosiah. So it's called the Mosiah priority. And so here's the published order of the books. I've got a little line about where they ended, and they lost the first part of the Book of Mormon and had to come back to it. But they started with Mosiah and they carried on to the end. And then they circled back around after Moroni and came to First Nephi and Second Nephi, Jacobinus, and so on. So this is the order. So let's talk about what compromises the narrator voice of the Book of Mormon. So there are some very consistent elements of the narrator voice. The tense is past. The voice is usually passive. It's not just a tense in the voice, it's also the vocabulary and the grammar that are kind of consistent in the narrator voice. There's specific words that you see showing up in the narrator voice, like God for deity, phrases that are specific to the narrator voice. And you see literary devices. So Ganesh Cherian in his Joseph Smith biography points out that there are stories that are repeated. So there's these devices which are reused, but they're reused in the narrative portion of the text. And so it's not just what Rob Terry is coming up with. There are other elements like this that show up consistently in the narrator voice. It combines the voices of Zenoth, Mormon, Helaman, and Moroni. So what's important here is that if you're the author of the Book of Mormon, you would think, I need to make Zenoth sound different from Mormon and different from Helaman and Moroni. But the narrator voice shows up in all these four authors. And so it's curious that you're creating a book with diversity, but it's coming across in the narrator voice and the sermon voice, not in the authors. And here's just some examples. If you just search for roundabout or came to pass, then you'll see examples of this voice. The sermon voice in the Book of Mormon, first person generally, it's usually present tense. And again, there's consistent vocabulary and grammar. There's names for deity, usually Lord and Lord God. There are phrases which are unique to this voice, including some of the 19th century elements. So we talked earlier about one counterclaim to the faithful narrative is that there's 19th century material, and this is some of it in the sermon voice. And Ganesh also talks about chiasmus, and from his perspective, it's from what he's saying. And again, some of this is new. I just, engaged Ganesh a few weeks ago, and he's got some new videos that you should go look at. But consistent in the sermon voice, but not in the other voice. Then you've got the combination of the multiple voices like Alma, King Benjamin, and Samuel the Lamanite. Again, you don't see the author of the Book of Mormon creating uniqueness in the authors or in the speakers. You see this uniqueness in the sermon. And then here's some examples. Again, if you search those phrases, you'll find in the Book of Mormon. All right, so Rob Terry is studying these two voices, and then he discovers that there's a late voice that's creeping in at the end. And there's also very definite characteristics as well. The person, you have increase of narrator speaking in first person. He says that Mormon rarely does this from Mosiah to Alma, and then it starts to do it more often. Moroni is doing it frequently, and then Nephi is doing it exclusively. So you see a pretty clear switch in how the person is treated as you progress from the beginning to the end. The voice, these switches between the narrator and the sermon, and we'll look at blocks of data here in a second. You'll see that the switching is more fluid. It's happening more often. The vocabulary, there's specific words that show up in the late voice that don't show up in the other two, and grammar. And then you have phrases which show up, which look unique to the late voice. When we talk about certain topics, they show up only in the late voice as well. And we'll look at the graphs on some of those. Okay, so those are the three voices. So let's look at some of the data. Okay, so these are common words that I'm focusing on. I've circled the ones in red where you have a significant difference between the narrator voice and the sermon voice. So the graph is basically Rob Terry counting the number of times each of these words are used in the narrator voice in the N column and the sermon voice in the S column. And you can see that I've put on the left side here, so you have context. The narrator accounts for about 45% of the text, the sermon 50%, and the late voice about 5%. So the narrator and the sermon, their sample sizes are roughly the same. So you would expect to see roughly the same amount of usage for these common words between the two. The ones that are highlighted with the darker color, they are more than 10 times in difference between the ratios in the narrator voice and the sermon voice. So you can see a lot of common words that we all use that are difficult to manipulate when we're creating characters that show up very differently in the data. And there's a fair number of them that show up 10 times more frequently in one voice than the other. So let's talk about the any questions on the graph?
Does the late voice, do you know, in are the sermons in the late voice counted as the sermon voice?
Yeah, that's a little unclear. We'll get into a little more descriptions of what's happening, but he says that the narrator voice and the sermon voice are there throughout even the late voice portion, so they're still there. It's just that you see like the late voice kind of overlaying.
Stylistic change. Yeah.
Possibly, right. And I have a slide that mentions that as well, and we'll talk a little bit about stylistic drift. All right, so the distinction between the narrator and sermon is much cleaner and stronger in the first half of the book. Voices in the later portion are still split between narrator and sermon, as we just mentioned. He says that it's rare but obvious when Mormon breaks between the third person narrative and first person sermon. Okay, so that's kind of in the earlier portion. It's obvious when Mormon does this, but it's less obvious when Moroni does it. So as you get later on, it's becoming harder to see those differences. And then when you get to Nephi, which is kind of the rewritten portion, it's not obvious at all. So the rewritten portion, either, Joseph is doing this himself. He's just trying to recreate basically what he had in his head the first time. If they had a text from Spalding and Rigdon, then they might have destroyed the text. And in that case, he's having to go from memory. Or if he has a text, for whatever reason, they're trying to make it sound different so that the people that took the 116 pages, if they show up again, they won't contradict the second go round. So I'm not sure. I think there's two possible ways that might explain why once you get to Nephi, and Jacob, why that's showing up very differently than the earlier parts of the Book of Mormon. And so here's a nice graph that Rob Terry has that shows when you plot out the narrator voice in the red and the sermon voice in the blue, you can see this very consistent frequent switching. And this is just Mosiah and Alma. So large blocks you have in kind of on the right-hand side, you have very, 6, 7, 8 chapters at a time that are all sermon. And then 7, 8, 9 chapters at a time that are almost all narrator. So big blocks and clear switching. Okay, so let's look at a couple graphs. The top one here is going to be House of Israel themes. So references to the House of Israel and related terminology, you can really see how it pops up in the late voice or in the late part of the Book of Mormon, and that's why he calls it the late voice. The second chart is the combination of IX, so I Alma, I Nephi, I Moroni, and you get kind of the same pattern where the way that the voice is seen is that in these two particular literary artifacts, they're showing up very differently than the rest of the Book of Mormon, the first 2/3, let's say. So these represent frequency per 2000. Could it be stylistic drift? It's possible, but I think we actually need more sophisticated research. I think we'll get into this in the wordprint studies, but for now, I look at that, and again, it probably requires more sophisticated research, but it doesn't look like stylistic drift. All right, critical takeaways. So what do we need to learn from all this information about Rob Terry's framework? The first important thing is that the voices carrying textual variety and uniqueness are not the predicted authors. They're actually the narrator, the sermon, and the late voice. Okay, so that's really important for us to understand when we're looking at elements of the data and the text. Where is it falling, and why is it splitting this way? I can't think of a other than the Spalding Rigdon theory or my theory. I can't think of why Joseph would create a narrator voice that's so unique from the sermon voice. And there might be somebody, that's smarter than me and better looking than me that comes forward with an idea that explains this. But so far, I don't think we have that. The narrator and the sermon voices are clear and consistent at the beginning and then less thereafter. There's a bigger shift to the muddling of the two voices and the prominence of the L voice starting in 3rd Nephi, but it's not much in 3rd Nephi. It grows gradually, but it's pretty heavy when you're getting into Nephi and Jacob. Unfortunately, this portion of the Book of Mormon, and maybe this is why, is the redictation of the lost pages is in the late portion of the Book of Mormon. Also, it's when they move from the Smith family home where they're dictating the Book of Mormon to the Whitmer family home. And so you also have that element, which is changing as well. So there's lots of things going on in the last 40% of the Book of Mormon dictation. And that makes it kind of interesting and challenging. So the switches are significant, not only because they're consistent, but there's a lot of switching. So it doesn't look like, so if you think Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon, it doesn't look like he just ripped this off at the top of his head. He had something that he was utilizing some skill, some technique, something going on. And the 3-voice framework overlays with the idea of multiple authors in the following way. The end voice, of course, would align with Spalding or Ethan Smith or somebody like them. These are educated authors. They've attempted to write the American epic drama. So there's Spalding and Smith, Ethan Smith. The S voice aligns with Rigdon, the Reform post-Campbellite minister described as a walking Bible in magnificent order. And the L voice aligns with Joseph, the enterprising young man whose family archetype and filler material like the Isaiah passages appear in the last part of the book. All right, so any questions on the first part of the presentation?
I want to make sure I understand. So basically, if I summarize this, the finding was that there's multiple authors, or at least 3 different voice styles: the narrator, the late voice, and the I can't remember what the S is for.
Sermon
Voice.
Sermon.
Yeah. So this you say supports. Obviously, this wouldn't support the Joseph Smith dictated it by himself so much. It would be multiple author. But does it support at all the church narrative that it was all these different guys who made up the Book of Mormon, and then it was put together by an editor?
Yeah, it doesn't support either Joseph framework. Because if Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon by himself, you would expect the textual variety to split along the vector of the authors, Nephi, Jacob, Enos. You wouldn't expect it to split on the vector of the sermon narrator literary voices. So it doesn't support either of those theories. And unless there could be a theory that we don't know about right now that comes forward that explains how that could be possible and support one of those two sides. But as far as what's been presented into the public realm right now, I think the best explanation is that there's multiple authors of the Book of Mormon based on this data. But again, to John's point, it's kind of a matter of degree. And so that's where the wordprint studies are important, because we have an intuitive look so far. We have a clear framework, which I think is very important, but we don't have statistical analysis being applied to this. So this is where the Book of Mormon wordprint studies come in.
I do have a comment on this, but maybe we'll reserve it for maybe Q&A afterwards.
I don't know. Make your comment if it applies to this section.
Exploring this. Look, This is fantastic. I look at something like the ancient Greek dramas, Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus. I mean, it's different, but what you have in the ancient Greek dramas are actors playing roles, and then you have a chorus, which really serves as a sort of narrative, um, as a narrator. The chorus will often speak in third person because they're narrating what is going on, whereas the actors will speak in first person because they're playing, the people in the play.
Right.
So if I did a word print study on ancient Greek dramas, and I know they've done stylometric studies just trying to show different authors. We get these Greek dramas and scraps, and so who wrote it? So they do the stylometric analysis to see, is this Sophocles or is it Aeschylus? But I'm unaware if what I can say is you get first person and third person narrations in different blocks because the roles are different. The
Yeah.
chorus serves a role, the actors serve a different role, and yet it's all one author. So again, I go back to I like the three voice analysis because it shows clearly the sermon voice is most often first person. The sermons in the Book of Mormon are almost always first person. Um, the narrative in especially Mosiah Alma is third person. Mormon is writing as an editor and he's summarizing. So he's acting as a narrator, and narrators speak in third person, just as the chorus speaks in third person in ancient Greek dramas. Um, but that just shows different styles of text. When I'm narrating a story, I'm going to speak in third person. When I'm sermonizing, I'm going to speak in first person. All the sermons given in Joseph Smith's day are preached by preachers speaking in first person. You can look them up. So I guess my critique then is in a three voice um, analysis, which you just shared, that doesn't necessarily mean three different authors. It could mean one author performing different roles. Once he tells a story, it's in third person. He gives a sermon, it's in first person. That can be one person just shifting roles as he's dictating the text. Do you understand my critique
Yeah.
here, Patrick?
Yeah, definitely. And we'll actually, I think, in a couple slides, we'll actually have a little bit of the LDS word print experts' view on that. Um, and again, I think it's a matter of degrees, and that's a whole area of word print science, is try to tease out the difference between literary voices or styles and authorship. So we'll definitely come back to that. But I think that's something that hopefully after this presentation is done and more feedback comes along, that's an area that is further explored. And I think it would be, if there's somebody out there that's trying to figure out a topic for a thesis or a dissertation, there's going to be some really, really, really sweet areas of research that could be taken from this. So yeah, I definitely, I understand that and appreciate it. And I think we'll talk about it. And after we get through the word print, we might want to revisit and see how we feel about it after that part. I would point out that um, the difference in the voices, and some of the difference in the themes and the topics and that are also explained by the different what the purpose that you're in, whether are you narrating, or are you preaching a sermon. Some of the different topics are going to split that way as well, but the common words is what's really the power of the word print, I think, is that would you change the number of times you're using a and the and an and o and that sort of thing. So any other questions before we jump into the word print? Okay, so this is the kind of the framework. I'm going to skip the last one. The last one actually is the first one that I showed you. So in the interest of time, that one got whacked. 1980, the first wordprint study. Before we get into that, I'm just going to introduce the topic. We've talked a little bit about it so far, but this is from some BYU experts who've done some of the wordprint of the Book of Mormon. I'm going to use wordprint instead of stylometry. So stylometry has actually, could somebody read that while I take a little bit of water to calm my throat down?
Landon, do you want to read
Yeah.
it?
Yep, I'll read it. Stylometry has most notably been used to help answer questions about text with disputed authorship, such as the Federalist Papers and some of Shakespeare's plays. Stylometry is not a perfect science, but over the years, its methods for distinguishing writing styles have become increasingly refined. In fact, it has been demonstrated that stylometric methods are able to detect an author's word use pattern even when he or she attempts to write in a different voice or to imitate another text style. The Book of Mormon's lengthy texts and complex content would make it especially difficult for its true authors to fool the stylometric analysis, whether intentionally or inadvertently. That's Matthew Roper, Paul J. Fields, and G. Bruce Schlage for Scripture Central. Okay, you know that's true if it comes from Scripture Central. So.
Yeah, so that's their take. I'm sure other people in this area of science might have slightly different degrees to which they would take that. And again, I think I'm just trying to frame where they're at on this. So you have a general idea of the area of science, and I'm going to ask you to actually put more emphasis on the actual data itself. So there's 7 wordprint studies dating from 1980 to 2018. 6 use common word analysis. An early one used vocabulary, and then nobody used that. And after that point, because it was determined that it wasn't a very effective method. Okay, so we've mentioned this: common words don't carry meaning; they're difficult to manipulate. And all later studies kind of refined. So when you think about a science is kind of mature or evolve over time. And when I was doing some research years ago, I asked John actually for a list of books that would help me understand religion and science and how they developed. And one of the books he sent me focused on this, how science in specific areas develop on different paths. And so you can have, let's say, Einstein's theory of relativity is, a very, very mature science. And then you have other sciences which are kind of new and less rigid because they have less experience, they haven't gone through the cycle of somebody does some research and they print it and people analyze it and critique it, and then it's tweaked and improved and more studies are done, and so you're standing on the shoulders of others. And so in this science, it seems fairly new, but you can see in the presentation that there's some evolution taking place in the science. And the most important study is unknown. And so that's probably one thing that hopefully is very exciting about the presentation. All right. The first one is 1980, Renshaw Larson at BYU. I was actually in high school at this time, and I specifically remember being at another family's house, a family from our congregation, and somebody saying, scientists have shown that the different authors in the Book of Mormon are actually different people. They've determined this through science. And so I actually remember this study coming out because somebody was talking about it. So here I am in middle school or high school at this time. Okay, they broke the text in the blocks of 5,000 words. They observed the number of common words per block. And so you're seeing this a pretty simple, straightforward study. You'll see how it evolves a little bit as it progresses along. They had to figure out where the speaker switches were taking place. The chapter and verse are kind of arbitrary, so they have to actually, read the book and break it up by speaker. They also tried to determine who wrote the lectures on faith because, of course, everybody thought Joseph did it all. So here's the graph that displays the results of their study. You can see that the data is clustering by author. You can see that Moroni is somewhat distinct, but it overlaps a bit. You can see that on one axis, at least, Joseph is aligned with the other data, but not on the y-axis. He's quite a bit above. The study authors claim that the author is the independent variable, meaning The reason why you see these clusters showing up where they are on the graph is because of the different authors. The study did not discriminate between narrative text and sermon text. And so kind of take a visual look at this. You have Alma, Mormon, Moroni, and Nephi kind of around the clock here. Rob Terry did an analysis that came up with the same results. Alma, Nephi, Mormon, Moroni, and Nephi kind of in the same positions on the chart. And what he did is he put the narrator voice on the x-axis and he put the sermon voice on the y-axis. And voila, you have pretty much the very same chart. So the difference in the voice is, in his analysis, he's showing is the difference does exist, but it's actually explained by the variation in the difference between the narrator and the sermon voice. That's the actual independent variable driving the change. He explains it this way. Could somebody read that quote?
The important trends in the NSL model of first person versus third person, past tense versus present tense, and preference for certain vocabulary are clearly the drivers for both charts. Okay, so again, we're kind of early simple analysis on this first study. This first study did get critiqued. So the study's authors claimed in addition that none of the Book of Mormon authors resembled the writings of any of the suggested 19th century authors. So you only saw Joseph in the chart. Dr. James Croft from the U of U looked at their methodology and determined that they had done it incorrectly in order to claim that the 19th century authors didn't match the Book of Mormon authors. He also made recommendations in his critique that they should use the earliest version of the Book of Mormon, the 1830 version. He also said that they should fine-tune the analysis for trying to, again, tease out the difference between different styles and different authors. He thought the phrase "it came to pass" was used so frequently that it should be removed from the study. And he recommended that they separate the narrator and the sermon voices. The study authors responded. This is all in I think it was a dialogue article. They said, we did compare Spalding to the text. Again, they're comparing Spalding with the narrator and the sermon combined. So they're comparing Spalding and Rigdon and Joseph. They said they didn't find a match, but they didn't actually publish this from what I can tell. I can't find any evidence on that. And flag this one, they did not compare Rigdon's data set to the Book of Mormon text at all. So the conclusions are that Terry shows the variance between the narrator, the sermon voice explains the variance in the data. The study demonstrates that you can use wordprint analysis to establish authorship, at least in this case, the lectures on faith, and that Rigdon wrote most or all of the lectures on faith. The prep work involved 2,000 character switches. So when they read through the book and said, okay, now it's, Mormon speaking, now it's Alma, now it's Samuel the Lamanite, now it's an angel. When you get all those switches, there's actually 2,000 character switches. So again, to me, that points to complexity, meaning there was some mechanism used by Joseph. It wasn't coming just from the top of his head. And here's the character switches. You can see that there's actually 5 switches in the text of Alma 8 in 2 different verses, two verses together, the 5 different characters. Later studies show that not using the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon and not removing "it came to pass" didn't actually affect the conclusions. And again, they avoid Rigdon altogether, and they avoid comparing Spalding to the narrator voice. So their study shows Book of Mormon has multiple authors. Now, again, this is the first study of the Book of Mormon, first wordprint study of the Book of Mormon. So let's see what happens with the science as it gets a little more mature. Here's a link to the study. Okay, Brian Roberts did the second study. He was a student in the statistics department, math and statistics, and he was getting his thesis done. And he was doing the study basically to correct all the critiques that were applied to the first study. And so what he did was, and he was studying under the 2 authors of the first study. So Rensher and Larson were kind of his thesis experts.
So he used the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon. Probably the most important thing he did was he split the Book of Mormon into not just the authors, but the narrator and the discourse. So all but Alma had enough of both literary types that we actually have 9 different samples of the data. So for example, you'll have Mormon narrator, Mormon discourse, Jacob narrator, Jacob discourse, etc. Discourse is their term for sermon, so I'll stick with sermon since that's what we use elsewhere. He took it came to pass out of the text. He tuned the baseline by including control data sets, his own voice, Isaiah, and he also tweaked the study a little bit. And he made a little more of a sophisticated approach at determining the word print. So not just words, but grammatical usage, sentence length, phrase construction, text density, etc. So you can see that things are starting to get a little more, sophisticated as we go along. And he also tested for the authorship of the 1832 Joseph Smith history. This reads just like it's, I Joseph did this and did that. But it was thought that it was probably scribed. So they're going to test for that. And the results of the study answer the main recommendation of Terry. Terry was not aware of this, and he said, we really need a word print study that splits narrator and sermon voice. Okay, everybody ready?
Here we go.
Here we go. Okay, so it doesn't look like much until we start putting some clusters around the different voices. So the first cluster is going to be the blue cluster here that shows all the narrator. So the first thing you're seeing, let me bring up the sermon voice as well. So the green is going to be the sermon voice. The first thing we're seeing is that we're not seeing Nephi cluster and Mormon cluster and Moroni cluster. We're seeing a sermon cluster and a narrator cluster. Okay, so Joseph's word print.
This is damning.
This is very damning. Maybe why nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah, well, they do talk about it, but they use this as positive, saying that it shows there's multiple voices, therefore that it's multiple authors, but it's actually the opposite.
Yep.
Right. So let's look at Joseph's voice. So Joseph is split, you can see, between the I and the H. That's the Joseph Smith history and the H, which is on the bottom part. And you can kind of draw a line. There's almost 2 separate bubbles there for Joseph's voice. So you can see that when Joseph speaks on his own, the word print is very different than when it's scribed. And so it could just be, in this particular case, the history got reworked and reworked. It's possible that that's what explains it. So this might just be Frederick G. Williams's word print, the H portion. But you can clearly see a difference between the Joseph Smith history that he partially scribed in his own hand and was partially scribed by Frederick G. Williams, and when he's writing his own letters. Okay, you can also draw a straight line in the blue circle in the narrator text. You can see that the later portion of the Book of Mormon is separating from the earlier portion. So at the very bottom, you see pretty tight clustering of Moroni and Mormon. And then you see that there's pretty tight clustering of Nephi altogether above it. And then Jacob is way off, close to Joseph and close to Williams. You don't see quite as much separation in the sermon text, but you do see the B kind of standing out there by itself. And the B is also Jacob. So the B and the L are Jacob. So the very last book in the Book of Mormon pulls closer to Joseph's word print than the rest of the text of the Book of Mormon. So I found that very interesting. And that's exactly what Rob Terry was predicting. It almost makes you want to tear up looking at it. And wow, it totally supports my theory. How's that happening? Well, I kid. I looked at all the data and then I created my theory after I looked at all the data. So let's put a graph or a bubble around the Lord and Isaiah text. Kind of interesting that the sermon author, pretty good at speaking, just like Isaiah and the Lord. I thought that was kind of interesting as well. And then when we look at the Roberts, so Roberts is Brian Roberts, the author of the study. His word print is here in purple. Excuse me. So you can see that there's clear separation between the narrator and the sermon. And if you take, this would muddy up the chart a little bit, but let me describe it. If you take a line and measure the distance between the big I, which is Joseph's voice, and the big J, which is Robert's voice, this is the difference between two different people. One whose voice is captured in 1830s and one who is captured in 1983. So 150 years apart, you have a line that's about 1.7 inches long. When you stretch that line between Joseph and the middle of the narrator bubble, or the center of the sermon bubble and the narrator bubble, you have a greater distance. So the separation between the author of the study and Joseph is less than the difference between the center of the narrator and the center of the sermon. So to me, I think this is where the wordprint study actually gives us a little more data on the difference between the literary style and the difference between the authors. And I think this chart right here pretty much establishes that there's multiple authors, that there's an authorial difference between the sermon voice and the narrator voice. So let me grab a drink here and let you guys respond.
We'll talk amongst ourselves. What do you think
Okay.
about that, John, in terms of the question and the things that you brought up before he showed the static?
Well, I mean, there's a clear difference between narrator and sermon. Also, a clear difference between narrator, sermon, Isaiah, and the Lord. That's what I'm seeing here, right?
Yeah.
And so the red circle is Joseph, right? Joseph Smith.
Right.
All right. So just summarize for me. The blue is narration.
Mm-hmm.
Green is sermon.
Right.
And they're going through all the text throughout the Book of Mormon and showing whenever a sermon shows up, it has a different word style. Wherever narrative shows up, it has a different word style.
Right.
And both are different than Joseph's small section of Joseph Smith history. And both are different than when they quote Isaiah out of the Bible.
Right.
This is what that data set is showing me, correct?
It's showing that, but it's also showing the difference, the qualitative difference, or sorry, the quantitative difference between those different voices. So when you look at the distance between the sermon voice and Isaiah, it's quite close. I mean, it almost overlaps. So the sermon author and Isaiah basically have a very similar word print, which is interesting. And it might represent how somebody grew up and became just religiously fanatical, or it might just be a coincidence. But you measure the distance between the center point of the different voices or the different authors to try and get a sense for what does different authorship look like, because that's the core question: is sermon and narrator, they're going to look different because they're different literary styles. But are they different enough that they actually support the theory that the text of the narrator is a different author than the text of the sermon voice? And I think this chart leads to that conclusion pretty firmly.
So if I'm performing a sermon, it overlaps Isaiah. So the sermons are Christian, evangelical, deeply biblical, often citing Bible verses or concepts within the sermon,
Right.
And all performed in first person. This is going to develop, if I'm semi-extemporaneously, actually, maybe Joseph Smith, so here's my pushback. Maybe Joseph Smith memorized contemporary sermons. He didn't have to memorize them word for word, but there hundreds and thousands of these are being performed around him during the Great Awakening. This is the intellectual tinder of the age. If I memorize sermons which are deeply rooted in biblical speech, biblical thought, yeah, that would overlap with Isaiah and the voice of the Lord. As opposed to if I am constructing my own narrative, that's largely third person in different characters, right? Because it's not a sermon voice, it's my own narrative. Then would I not expect to find uh, exactly what I'm seeing on the screen, in that I am here telling a story with different characters, and here I am performing memorized sermons that has a biblical background? Would that not produce the chart I am seeing?
Um, I think it could be an alternate explanation for more of the clustering of the sermon part. In that, so think of Joseph Smith's own word voice, the red bubble, and especially the I portion, which is not altered by being scribed. It's pretty close to the sermon voice. It's distinct, but it's close to the sermon voice. The Isaiah and the Lord references in the Book of Mormon are also close to the sermon voice. So those are kind of clustering together, but the narrator, especially Mormon and Moroni, are significantly different. They're further away from Joseph's word print than they are from Brian Roberts' word print. And we know Brian Roberts and Joseph Smith are two different people. So I think that could explain why everybody's sermoning is kind of close together, but the narrator part, it's almost like Joseph, like you say, he would have had to like memorize somebody's narrative part. And that's why this is so interesting. There's different ways, there's different explanations you can apply to it. And that's why this is not the end of the presentation, because there's a lot of additional information that speaks to where would that narrative text come from. And I don't get into the mechanics of the dictation, but I think I can explain it by some of the things that I've discovered in this research as well. So I don't know, does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah.
I think there's just such a difference between the narrator, especially Mormon and Moroni, that it really, it scores further apart than any other relationship on the chart.
What I can't, so this chart, so let's get through the rest of them, but this chart is definitely showing me a three voice pattern, which is what Terry predicted, which contradicts the previous chart.
I didn't split narrator and sermon, so again, you can almost toss it.
Right.
It shows that there's so if you go back to Rob Terry's theory, Alma is going to have just two authors. Nephi is going to have three authors. So you're comparing those two. So would you expect a difference between Nephi and Alma? Yes, you would actually. So I think that's what explains the difference between those two. And other studies coming up will key off of Nephi versus, Alma and Mormon as well. So I think the prior chart doesn't contradict any of what we're showing. It just it's kind of like the difference between Newtonian physics and relativity. Newtonian is not incorrect when we get to what Einstein's adding. He's just saying that's all good, but when you get to the speed of light, then things get kind of wonky, and you have to understand space-time and that sort of stuff. So to me, it's kind of similar where I don't think there's anything wrong with the analysis, but we can't explain it based on the fact they didn't split the voices out between sermon and narrator.
Very good.
I've got a quick question on the Isaiah portion, or the Lord's portion that we're talking about. I'm guessing that's the quoted out of the King James version of the Bible. So do we look at that just simply as, well, it doesn't matter that the King James version of the Bible changed the writing from the original Hebrew or Isaiah, and therefore, because that writing isn't going to look anything like what Isaiah originally wrote in Hebrew. How do they account for that? Are they just saying, well, we're just comparing King James version of the Bible, that's it? Because obviously, if he's quoting Isaiah from Hebrew in the Book of Mormon versus Isaiah from the King James version, we should see two different things coming from Isaiah, and here it looks like Isaiah is the same no matter what.
Yeah, there's a little separation, but not as much. And I went back through the study last night trying to understand the Lord / Jesus, and there's not a lot of good information. It's basically I picked the 7 authors that were most frequently represented in the text, and Lord Jesus is one of them. So my interpretation of that is that if it says, and the Lord saith, then they would just take that phrase and call it the Lord. And so that might be a quote out of the New Testament, or, paraphrasing out of the New Testament, or it might actually be the sermon author just saying that this is what the Lord said and claiming this is what the Lord said. So I think it could be New Testament reference, or it could be just something representing what the Lord said. Okay, so the conclusions off this study, and again, I'm not an expert in wordprint study. take that caveat, but I think the narrator and sermon voice are 2 different voices, but also statistically, we can conclude they're 2 different authors. I think Joseph, a sole author, is clearly not supported in the data. Again, there could be explanations that come out from smarter people than me, but I think that this really supports the idea that the Joseph's contribution is minor. It would only show up in the very end of the book, and that's supported by the word print of Jacob and Nephi kind of being closer to Joseph. So his word print is pulling some of those samples closer to him than Mormon and Moroni. Separation in the data actually showed that the 1832 Joseph Smith history was scribed. Okay, so they got that right, and here's what that looks like in the off the Joseph Smith papers database. I thought it was interesting to note that nobody is mentioning this study, especially all those LDS sources that do a nice summary of all the other data, and then they leave this one out. Again, we're avoiding Rigdon and Spalding, and I think it shows multiple authorship. And a link to the study. Okay, so if you were to Google his name and wordprint study, there's only one result in the entire internet, and it's to this archive site. Okay, so the third study is
one other quick question here, because you're pulling up all these studies. Is there any possibility that there was a word print study done that showed that proved that it wasn't one of these? Would it ever see the light of day? Since these all seem to be LDS authors performing the studies.
I don't know. I thought that study, I mean, even if John's pushback is correct, I think if you're coming from an LDS standpoint, you wouldn't want anybody to see that study. And yet it's still stored out there as as in the area where they're storing people's theses and dissertations. So they didn't bury it, but they may not have known what it says, and they may not have appreciated what it, having that public, what that would imply. Certainly that happened with Fawn Brody when she wrote "No Man Knows My History." She's the niece of the prophet of the church, David O. McKay, and she's like, "Hey, I want to write a biography of Joseph Smith," and they're like, "Sure, go ahead." And here's the keys to the archives, the historical archives, and she comes back with, Joseph had 30 wives, and I don't think they realized what they were getting into. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I actually addressed this a little bit at the very end as well, like what's in the archives. Okay, so the third one, authored by John Hilton. He was a physicist, a really smart guy at Lawrence Livermore. He engaged a team at Berkeley. They were non-LDS, and so this is called out in kind of the reviews of the study, because they're trying to say, hey, look, we have non-LDS people putting the methodology together, and they got it peer reviewed. And I should say it took them 7 years to get the peer reviewing of the methodology. So they really were methodical in putting this thing together. Other aspects of this, I'm going to claim some really big problems that we'll get to here shortly. So it's a new model. They used common word pattern ratios. Again, it's getting a little more complicated how they figure out what somebody's word print looks like. They're looking at collocation of words and proportionate pairs of words and so on. And then they analyze it very differently. They differentiate word clusters between 2 different texts based on the number of word pattern ratios that are judged by the model to be significantly different. These are called rejections, and then they count the number of rejections. So we'll see this in the chart, but basically, here's a text, we're going to compare them. The model is going to look for differences that you shouldn't expect, and they're going to call that a rejection. The number of rejections, kind of on a scale, help us understand whether it's two different authors or not. They adopt all the recommendations of Croft about the early version of the Book of Mormon. They split the sermon and the narrative, and they compare it against Book of Mormon authors, as well as the potential candidates, Joseph, Cowdery, and Spalding. Is there somebody missing here?
Rigdon.
Joseph, Cowdery, and Spalding. Where's Rigdon? Okay, the most likely author is not included. And they decided to choose the sermon voice. So here's where I think Hilton would understand the Book of Mormon. He's, the methodology team at Berkeley, they're non-LDS. I think the choice of leaving Rigdon out was probably Hilton's choice. And I also think that it was probably Hilton's choice to leave out the narrative voice and only use the sermon voice. And I think that also because when you actually read through it, that decision is buried in very technical, in a long paragraph of technical description. And they call it the didactic genre. And so I had to go look that up. John, you probably know what didactic means. I didn't know what didactic means. So when I looked it up, I'm like, what? They only used the sermon voice? So I'm alleging a little bit of deception here on the part of this study. And I'll just leave it at that. If we have further follow-up in future studies, I can dig more into that and actually show you that sentence and that description. So here's the table. The sermon voice that you see at the bottom, that's me, because you have to keep reminding yourself it's only the sermon voice, because when they present it, they don't present it. And so you're thinking, sermon and narrative, and it's not. Okay, so let's put some context to this. Nephi and Alma were written by different authors. That's his main conclusion. So in the green box, you have Nephi versus Alma. So we're saying the number of rejections. And again, they think if it's more than 7, it's definitely a different author. Less than 7, and the closer you get to 0, you're getting closer to where we're saying it's the same author between the two different sets of data they're comparing. All right, so Nephi and Alma definitely looks like two different authors. You're clustering around 6 and 7 rejections. But curiously, you've got one of the comparisons that has only 2 rejections. And I think what you're seeing here is that, again, as I alluded to, Alma is, since this is a sermon voice, Alma's sermon is only Rigdon. Nephi sermon voice is Rigdon and Joseph. So I think you're getting a sample that has just Rigdon and just Rigdon. And so that's showing up with fewer rejections. That's why you have that anomaly on the left there. That's my interpretation, at least. They also conclude that it's unlikely that any external author wrote the Book of Mormon. Well, of course, that's what you're going to conclude when you exclude Rigdon. When you compare Spalding, the narrator, to the sermon voice, Joseph's contribution, we know, was very limited, and it was mixed with Rigdon's in the sermon voice. And so, yeah, you're not going to get a clear comparison with Joseph. And Cowdery, again, lesser likely that he's an author. So this study wasn't really going to ever answer the question of, did any external authors write the Book of Mormon? Okay, let's get into the comparison of Nephi, and Alma. This is kind of interesting because you're seeing that there's a lot fewer rejections in the Alma than the Nephi. And again, I think it's the same thing. Alma is all Rigdon, so that's going to look like one person. Nephi is Joseph and Rigdon, so you're getting this mix, which is going to give you a wider band. You're going to have some that look like the same author and some that look like different authors because you have a different ratio of the mix of Joseph and Rigdon versus Alma, where it's all Rigdon. Okay, let's look at comparing Smith versus Cowdery. You have the Smith data. Looks much closer than the Cowdery data. Cowdery definitely is not an author based on the results of this study, as far as you can take it. And so the conclusions are that Nephi and Alma shows different authors. Joseph is more likely a contributor than Cowdery. The study avoids Rigdon altogether, and they compare Spalding to the wrong voice. all future references to this study from LDS sources fail to point out the problem that I just identified. And I only learned about that by actually reading the study. So I find, again, we're not being completely transparent when we're talking about this study. The study confirms the three-voice framework in multiple ways, not just that Alma sermon is really tightly packed. That the Nephi sermon is got more variety in it, and so on. You've got pointing to, again, Nephi versus Alma as multiple authors, and a link to the study. So thoughts on this one?
Again, when we say multiple authors, we're talking 2 to 3, not dozens.
Yeah, it really, you can hang your hat on the Nephi comparison versus Alma. Looks like two different authors, even though according to Rob Terry's framework, the Alma sermon and the Nephi sermon are comparing one author and two authors, but they're different enough that they actually are statistically showing up as two different authors. And again, the magic is in the model. The magic in determining the difference between the voice and the difference between two authors is really the quality of the model. And that's hard for us to really get at.
Again, I'd like to point out Alma is narrative, written in third person. Nephi writes in first person narrative and dialogue. When you speak in first person, you have different word choices.
Yeah.
And when you speak in third person, you have different word choices. So this would show up as two different people. The question is why? Why is one being performed in first person, and why is one being performed in third person? Is that two different people contributing to the text?
Yeah. Like I said, I think the magic is in the model, and the models are being designed to try and tease that out. And so at the very end, I'll kind of give a spoiler alert here. I'm going to beg anybody that knows how to do a wordprint study to try and tease apart all the differences that we're talking about.
I find it an odd choice, the focus only on the sermon voice.
Yeah.
Leave out Rigdon. I mean, Rigdon is, if you apply the Spalding-Rigdon theory, he's the number one alternative for, the alternative explanation of the Book of Mormon. And to leave him out, these seem to be more than odd choices. These seem to be engineered choices.
Yeah.
Especially the sermon, because most of the sermons are Campbellite in nature, which would lead you to think Rigdon might be the author of those.
Not if you didn't want people to think that, then you wouldn't make that comparison for sure. But I agree with you, Patrick. I think a lot of people say, a couple of years from now, AI will solve this. Who wrote the Book of Mormon? And I think you're hitting it right there. It will be able to analyze all the differences that John is talking about and, come to some kind of, conclusion for us. Maybe is it a voice? Is it a single person speaking in different voices because they're third person, first person? It's interesting to see what will happen, but this is fascinating.
Yeah. I think I'm just putting the data out there.
Yeah, no, I know exactly. And we're so happy that you are, because it's fascinating.
You're doing an excellent job, actually, and you're being very thorough. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was going to mention that, I think it's important to note they'll point to these and say these were non-LDS scholars, but likewise, non-LDS scholars don't know the history of the LDS Church. They don't know who they should be looking for. They're only going to be able to compare the data that you gave them and ask them to compare. And if you don't give that to them, they're not going to on their own say, oh, what about this Rigdon guy? Shouldn't he be?
Hilton is LDS, though, right? The author of the study is LDS.
Yes, the person giving the data is LDS, but the people conducting it are only taking the data that they're given by the LDS study person. So
that's clearly what I'm alleging is conspiracy is probably too strong of a word, but I think that the non-LDS team that were kind of the experts in the analytical, creating the methodology, They're creating a methodology that can help us determine authorship. That's their role. His role, being the only LDS person, was to provide the decision to only use the sermon text and to exclude Rigdon. I'm sure that would have been his decision. So I ran across Mormonism with the Murph episode with John Hilton's grandson, John Hilton III. And I emailed him and said, hey, I've got some questions about this study I'd like to ask. And he pointed me to the authors of the 2018 study. And I emailed them and they're like, yeah, let's, happy to answer any questions. But then when I emailed back, they have ghosted me. So I've tried to follow up to figure out if I can get somebody to explain why they left out Rigdon and why they chose the sermon voice only, when that undercuts their ability to say it wasn't Rigdon,
If you can make this analysis, wouldn't you think they could have made that same analysis to determine that the
you could make a further
voice...
conspiracy and say maybe they did run the Rigdon analysis. I mean,
we love conspiracies here on Mormonish. So go ahead.
The Rigdon analysis is in Warehouse 13.
It is in the granite vault somewhere. So, and as all of us point out, the text is really all they have left, as far as evidence, everything else. They turn to the text all the time to try to show things. And when people kind of attack that, there could be a conspiracy theory involved because all they have left is the text.
Yeah. I was going to say, which goes back to what Patrick said earlier. This is a younger science, not as accurate a science as, say, DNA or archaeology or linguistics. Linguistics maybe is a little less, but still, you look at your hard sciences that no doubt prove something, and we get Oak standing up and saying, that kind of slamming science. But then they go to the less accurate science as their proof of source, and they've got to be real careful because this science will get more and more accurate as time goes by. And every time they've relied on the inaccuracy of science, when science gets better, it burns them on it. So,
and that's what happened with DNA. And that's a brilliant point, Landon. You're right. Where there's wiggle room within an emerging science and it seems to support their narrative, they'll jump all over it. But then as that science gets more conclusive, like DNA, then it's extremely problematic because they kind of hung their hat on it, and then they're scrambling. So I see that in this word count too.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to recap, we've got 3 studies so far and not one has included Rigdon. So just to put a flag on that. Okay. Number 4 is Holmes. So he's non-LDS, he's British. And he studies noun richness. So this is kind of the anomaly study where it's a methodology which is largely discredited. It is an interesting graph, though. You see on at least one of the axes that the Smith wordprint or Smith's vocabulary is very different from the rest of the Mormon scripture that they're evaluating. Again, he didn't separate narrative and sermon, which would have been critical. He concludes that the Book of Mormon voices don't have statistically different vocabulary range, so it could have been written by one author. And, do I think Rigdon and Spalding would have had different vocabulary ranges? Probably not. They're both very well-read men. So that's why there's trouble. And they tried to use this type of an approach with the Federalist Papers, and it failed. For the same reason, basically. All 3 of those potential authors had a similar vocabulary range. Rob Terry says, although the frequencies vary significantly, vocabulary range between the narrator, sermon, and late voices in the Book of Mormon is roughly the same. So the findings don't necessarily contradict his framework. Even as we largely say this study we can't really hang too much on this study. They avoided Rigdon and Spalding, and it's the 4th study showing that at least I debated putting like a 3.5 or 3.25, but let's just say it's the 4th study that shows a pretty significant difference in the vocabulary range of Joseph versus the rest. So that's that one. again, I don't want to hang too much on this one, so I just put one slide on it. Same for the fifth study. So what happened with this study is that this study is not available online anywhere. It's referenced in the citation of one of the Scripture Central articles where they say, experts at Utah State did a study that confirmed the 1980 study, or the 91 Hilton study. And I'm like, where is that study? So I actually called the Utah State math department and got a copy of it. So basically what they're doing is saying, we've got a new model that shows the difference or helps us understand authorship of unknown texts. So they looked at Jane Austen's last novel, which was unfinished, and then a lady finished it for her. And people seem to think she did a great job with it, but they were testing their model against that, plus the Federalist Papers, plus the Book of Mormon to test out their model. And here's what some of the statistical math look like. Kind of interesting, kind of impressive. Literature review confirmed that vocabulary richness is not reliable. We just talked about that in the fourth study. The literature review also indicated that the 91 Home study, where they used only the sermon voice and they compared Spalding to the sermon voice and they didn't include Rigdon, had not been challenged. And so I think this presentation today is the first challenge of that study. The study conclusion is that the Nephi text and the Mormon text are statistically different authors. And they don't have some lovely graphs, so that's why I picked some of the math here to show you. Again, the fifth study out of 5 that doesn't include Rigdon, and they didn't include Spalding at all. And they're saying that their analysis shows multiple authorship between Nephi and Mormon. Okay, and their presentation was pretty quick. They didn't have a lot more detail than what I'm presenting here. All right, I have a copy if anybody wants me to email it to them. The sixth study, this one's going to take a little bit longer to get through. This is written by Craig Criddle. Is not, he has a PhD in environmental science or something like that at Stanford, and he was doing he's a Spalding-Rigdon theory proponent. So he was doing analysis on his own, and he said, this is really time consuming. Let me get with somebody that's a statistician that can actually do a legitimate analysis. So he grabbed Daniela Witten, who is that did the statistical part of this. All right, so this is important to understand how they did their study. They used the Delta and the NSC. They're 2 different models. You don't have to understand what they are, just that they had 2 different testing methodologies. And they used both of them independently to evaluate each chapter in the Book of Mormon. So chapter by chapter, every single chapter, who do you think wrote this chapter among the potential authors? Their potential authors, Spalding, Rigdon, Cowdery, Parley, Pratt, Isaiah, and Malachi, kind of as a control. And then they used Longfellow and Barlow, who were contemporary authors who wrote kind of in a similar style. They did not include Joseph. They thought that Joseph's work was often scribed, or that the stuff written in his hand was, he'd write part of it and the scribe would write part of it, and then he would write part of it. And they just didn't have a high level of confidence, so they left Joseph out. They did their fine tuning, and they predicted that, it would get it right most of the time, chapter by chapter. There's 239 attempts at guessing which chapter or which author wrote each chapter. So I think it's important to understand that they're not predicting that it's going to be 100% accurate. There's a limitation in their design, which I haven't seen anybody talk about. Again, Rob Terry's contribution is relevant here. They broke up the data chapter by chapter. What problem might that cause us? If you look at the green arrows, they're pointing to really big blocks where the entire chapter is narrative or the entire chapter is sermon. What about these over here, where the chapter is literally 50-50 or close to 50-50? What is the model going to guess, Spalding or Rigdon? It really is going to be harder for the model to pick that. But the first and the second place choices should be very consistent, because if it can't pick, I mean, it can't pick between Spalding and Rigdon if it's 50-50 anyway. So that's a limitation that we'll see in the data. So here's the data, the results. 20 of 21 Isaiah chapters were properly attributed. The two different approaches agree on first place assignment 62% of the time. So if you look at this chart, what percentage of the chapters are split 50-50, and the model is going to have a hard time picking between one of the two because there's actually both in the text. Well, the answer is 62%. There's a total of 223 chapters, 93% they agree on the first two authors. So when you have to pick between one, you get a little variation, but when you can pick between the two, the first two most likely authors, you're consistently getting Rigdon and Spalding. So where they agree, you've got Isaiah coming in at 49, Rigdon coming in at 46, Spalding at 34, and then a little bit to the other kind of alternative authors. Okay, the critique was pretty hard from the BYU statisticians. The first criticism is obviously legitimate, that they have a closed set study of potential authors, and they're not including Joseph, who was clearly one of the potential authors.
That seems kind of an odd argument to come from the church, that, hey, you're not considering that Joseph could have written.
Yeah.
Like, did you want us to?
Yeah, well, you'll see there's a little good faith coming up here. They criticize the difference between relative and absolute probabilities. Lars Nilsson has a book called How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass.
Oh, yeah.
And he interacted with the study's authors, and he talks about this difference. And I don't find that that's a very compelling argument, that the difference there. You're just saying who's the most likely person, whether it's relative or absolute. One is, hey, this Rigdon is 80% likely to have written this chapter. The other is, if Spalding was 20%, then Rigdon is 4 times as likely to have written this chapter. So the study authors, they actually reran their study with Joseph's writing in it. And Lars Nilsson points to this as well in his book. They published some graphs, but they didn't publish the results, the actual results. So the LDS critics took the Joseph study and reran their study with the Joseph wordprint in it. So what does the results look like here? Some of the LDS discussion of this online will refer to this as a separate study, but it's kind of an extension of the 08 study. So here's the results that the critics came up with. And from what I can tell of the charts that Jockers and Criddle and Witten have published, it's similar. So if you look at the blue charts where they don't have Joseph, you see that Joseph is 0 because I didn't consider him. You have Rigdon almost 40%. You have Spalding a little above 20. When you include Joseph, he shows up a little over 10%. But Rigdon is actually going up a little bit to 40%, and then Spalding down a little bit. Cowdery and Pratt drop off to almost nothing, and the control authors drop off. So I find this to be maybe what we call directionally correct or important, in that it's saying of all the potential authors that are included, including Joseph on those the red lines, Joseph shows up a little bit, Spalding more, and Rigdon the most. Okay. And so you can see that the framework, just as a reminder, predicted 50% for the sermon voice, 45 for narrator, and 5 for late voice. So they're not exactly correlating, but they're directionally correlating. All right. And so I think you can conclude that the most likely authors of the Book of Mormon are Rigdon and Spalding versus Joseph. But again, I'm proposing that Joseph wrote part of the Book of Mormon, part of the late, that he is the late voice. So this actually supports my theory. And that's kind of the bottom line conclusion, given all the kind of the back and forth and the concerns that people have voiced on it. So thoughts on this one?
Has there been a wordprint study that's compared the sermon portion of the Book of Mormon to the other scriptures, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price?
That's the one question I had for that Kurt Armand, who did the Spalding Rigdon presentation. I asked him because he has a slide that says the DNC also, somebody did a word print on the DNC and it shows Rigdon in there, but doesn't show Spalding, of course, but it shows Rigdon more than Joseph. And I asked him, I've gone online, I've used Google and Bing and AI, and I can't find anything. So I don't know where he got it, but he had the data and it was in the same general format as this. So I'm pretty sure these authors also looked at the DNC, but I can't find the data. So that'd be excellent if we could track that down on a follow-up.
Well, and I'd like to know, maybe not everybody knows, but Rigdon, of course, formed his own church, became, Bickertonites, and he wrote scripture. A lot of us have read some of this as he's writing letters to his followers. The scripture sounds an awful lot to a lay person like me, like the DNC. He was mailing all this scripture to them. I would love to see analysis, and maybe it exists, of that, because it's in the style of the DNC. To just, like I said, a lay person, it uses the same words. You've read that, Landon. You've read Rigdon's scripture after the fact, and an analysis of that would be absolutely fascinating if it hasn't already been done.
The strange part of it was claimed to be some of the lost Book of Mormon, some of the sealed portions of the Book of Mormon. Which how did Rigdon see the sealed portions of the Book of Mormon if he wasn't even around when the Book of Mormon was created? And so he writes scripture that's supposedly in the sealed portion that talks very similar to the Book of Mormon language. So
and he's spouting off revelations. You need to build me a house. Very similar. I would love to see studies, if they exist, or somebody to tackle that, because that would be extremely damning. This is after the fact. This is after Joseph has died. This is when Sidney is trying to direct his followers by providing revelations and portions of, sealed portions of the Book of Mormon. And we have those writings.
Oh yeah, that those points you're making are good. And I will say there's kind of a free copy of this study online on, if you go to SolomonSpalding.com or SidneyRigdon.com. Dale Broadhurst has just an enormous amount of data. He passed many years ago, and his websites are kind of old school, but a ton of data. And he addresses there's a lot more information than I'm presenting here because of time, but they actually do compare Rigdon's early word print and his later word print, and there is a shift. He has some significant mental illness challenges later in life. He had significant injuries to his head as well. That if you remember, he was tarred and feathered with Joseph in 1832, and he was dragged along the ground, on the frozen ground, and he had some sort of mental breakdown after that. So they looked at that and they said, well, how can you compare? They were criticizing that the study had picked some of Rigdon's late writing from the Post collection, when they saw a significant difference in his word print between the two different time periods. So there's a lot more going on there, but they're coming at it from the angle that we want to discount Rigdon as much as we can, because the results are pointing to Rigdon pretty clearly here. So that's their approach, is to say,
I thought both of us cut you off.
Okay. No, I'm good.
John didn't have any thoughts? Okay.
All right. So the general conclusion for this section: all 6 word prints using common word analysis point to multiple authorship. Again, I use the word point to. I don't say prove beyond a reasonable doubt or prove definitively, just they point to multiple authors. The 1980 studies conclusions still hold up with the original, with the continuing evolution. The 83 study shows that the narrator and sermon are from different authors. 6+ studies, I put a plus for the vocabulary study, point to sole author not being correct. Most of the studies avoid using Rigdon or Spalding, as we talked about, and I think it's presumptive to just casually dismiss the results of these because you don't have an expertise in this area. And then finally, again, a plea to anybody who could help push this science further. There's amazing tools right now that could surely help provide a lot of more data points and information. Okay, so section 3, where did the textual clues point? All right, so when I cropped this thing down for time, some of it didn't make the cut, so you'll see that here. Joseph's role limited to dictation of the Book of Mormon. So in those later years, in that collection you referenced, Rebecca, Joseph, through some of his followers, he wrote or they wrote, but it's thought to believe that Rigdon actually wrote an appeal to the Latter-day Saints. So he's writing to the other branches of Mormonism. He's got his own church. And he claimed, if you read through this, that Joseph was supposed to just dictate the Book of Mormon, or be the voice of the words coming out, or let's say the doctrine is coming out through his mouth, but I'm supposed to do everything else, I being Rigdon. So here he's separating two different administrations or two different roles. The role of Joseph is to bring forth the word, which is to dictate the Book of Mormon. And then Rigdon's role was to send the words to the ends of the earth. It's under Rigdon's administration that Israel is to be gathered the way prepared for the coming of Christ. So there's a larger mission than just the Book of Mormon dictation. So wouldn't it be great if, and this is late 1863, wouldn't it be great if we had something earlier that was pointing to this point? Well, in 1833 in the D&C, we actually have the relationship formalized where it specifically calls out Rigdon as being that spokesperson who was supposed to do those things that he claimed in 1863. And wouldn't it be great if we had something earlier that came before Rigdon shows up on the scene? Well, we have that in 1829 in the Book of Commandments, section 4. Before Rigdon is around and supposedly not having anything to do with Mormonism, the Book of Commandments says, quote, "And he has a gift to translate the book, and I have commanded him that he shall pretend to no other gift, for I will grant him no other gift." So God is pretty explicit here. God is pretty firm. I'll kind of jump a little bit ahead. We haven't talked about Joseph yet. Joseph was excelled in magic. He could go on treasure digs, and he would lead the treasure digs. He was the guy that was telling everybody where to dig. And when they couldn't find the treasure, he would always find a way to get out of that situation, that pickle that he's in. And it's because he excelled at the ability to have a way out, to have another path. And so I just find that this scripture doesn't really give you much of an out. And then in 1835, his out is to basically just rip up what God said back then and rewrite it and say, okay, Joseph does have extra gifts. As soon as he does the first gift, then he can do other gifts. So that's how we kind of get past that very clear commandment not to do anything but to translate the Book of Mormon. Wouldn't it be nice if there was something in the Book of Mormon itself that limited Joseph to dictation? Well, we have that too. We have 2 Nephi 3, 7 to 18. This is a section where it talks about Joseph of Egypt, Joseph of old, and that the Lord will raise up somebody of his seed that has the same name, and his father is called by the same name. So this is where you're getting Joseph Smith built up in the Book of Mormon as being prophesied in the ancient texts as having a role in the latter days. And it says, would somebody read that? I'll take another drink here.
Another drink. The second Nephi, is that what you want?
Mm-hmm.
2 Nephi 3, 7 through 18 specifically limits the role of Joseph to dictation of the Book of Mormon. It says, and the Lord has said, I will raise up a Moses, yet I will not loose his tongue that he shall speak much. For I will not make him mighty in speaking, but I will write unto him my law by the finger of mine own hand, and I will make a spokesman for him. Provides additional critical insight. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So what we have in the Book of Mormon is the same limitation that you see in the Book of Commandments, which is written about the same time as the Book of Mormon, specifically saying, Joseph, don't get out of your lane. Your lane is to dictate the Book of Mormon, and then I'll take it from there. And so I find this to be really compelling evidence towards the thesis. And then I was thinking, so in his example of Moses, and the Lord is writing on the tablets with his own hand. Who is God with his finger writing the doctrine in this case? My theory is that it's actually Rigdon is playing the role of God here, providing the doctrine. Joseph is delivering it, and then Rigdon takes it and expounds on it and really tries to convert people and bring them to Christ and to bring them to Zion and to prepare the way for the second coming, as we read in the 1863 reference. Bill and RFM cover this in episode 166 of Mormonism Live. They go into a lot more detail than we have here. Appellation words. So this is kind of a whole another way to look at it. Lars Nilsson, in the book I mentioned before, How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, he points out that the Book of Mormon has a lot of occurrences of a prefixing. So we was a going. And this is what people think sounds like hillbilly language or an educated person's language. And so they attribute it to Joseph. But Joseph grew up in Vermont and New Hampshire and then later New York. This type of speech was not common in these parts of the country. And I went through the Joseph Smith Papers database, and there's only a single instance of Joseph using this in his own handwriting. And it's in a letter he wrote to Emma from the Liberty Jail. And he was with Rigdon, and he'd been with Rigdon for 6-7 years already by then. So only one instance of Joseph ever using this. Rigdon grew up in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and his writings make frequent use of a prefixing, and those of his children. So his children wrote about him as well. We have probably more from them writing about himself than we do from him. And when I was listening to that 4-hour podcast on the Spalding-Rigdon theory that Kurt Harmon had, he quoted one of the ladies that worked at the post office in Pittsburgh, and she described her duties as assorting the mail. So you have that a prefixing showing up in another lady in Pittsburgh as well, where Rigdon grew up. So a prefixing is really more of a Rigdon fingerprint than it is a Joseph fingerprint. And then Lars points out that the Book of Mormon also has 4-2, which is an appellation construction 14 times, and that shows up in Rigdon's other writings, which I looked up online. Okay, last 116 pages of the Book of Mormon. It's dramatically different than the rest of the Book of Mormon. We've talked about this a little bit already. It's so different that it helps Terry discover the third voice. Just a reminder of what the chart looks like. The replacement text was described as going to be more religious in nature. Well, if the narrator is not on the scene at that point and it's just Joseph and Sidney, then yeah, it's going to be a lot more religious in nature. The rewritten portion has a black hole of specificity, is what the Tanners call it. There's only 11 names in Nephi. There's none in Second Nephi. There's just general references. There's something clearly going on that's very different. This could be explained by them not wanting to recreate the text too similar to the original text and being contradicted by Lucy Harris. But I think it actually points also to the thesis. The authors also lose the ability to do math. The population sizes for the large battles and building temples and the number of generations, all of the math is way off. And so when they get to the end of Jacob, they've got like 300 years to fill out. And so you have Jeremiah and Words of Mormon and let's see, I missed one there. So there's just a stark difference between the replacement text of the Book of Mormon and the rest of the Book of Mormon, which points to, I think, different authorship. Okay, next we have Smith content. So we rely on Ganesh Charian's analysis here. So Ganesh points out that, and other people have called this out, but he just kind of summarizes it very, very well in his topical biography. You have Joseph that looks like Nephi. You have Joseph Sr. that looks like Lehi. When they lost their farm, the guy who foreclosed on them was named Lemuel Durfee. And, you know, he's a bad guy. And the bad guy in the Book of Mormon is Lemuel. You have the Tree of Life. So Joseph's father had a Tree of Life story that was very, very close to Joseph Jr.'s story, the Tree of Life. I'm sorry, the Book of Mormon version of the Tree of Life. when they get to the Whitmer family farm to do the last, let's say, third of the dictation, the Whitmers are Germans, and the Germans had been fighting with, as Protestants, they'd been fighting with Catholics, and so it's thought that Joseph probably never met a Catholic even, so he wouldn't have had strong feelings one way or the other. But the Whitmers definitely would have had strong feelings against the Catholics. So the anti-Catholic messaging in the Book of Mormon shows up in the portion that you would expect it to show up in. And then he notes this other thing. There's a second person that pops up speaking directly to the audience with some sort of interaction going on with the Whitmers. And so I find that very interesting. Again, the portions that point to Joseph show up in the late voice. And I think there's a lot more analysis that could be done here too. We have complexity in the Book of Mormon. We have some kind of knowledge of the maps of the Arabian Peninsula. Those maps were available in college libraries. There's no evidence Joseph wandered into a college library. Maybe that kind of topic was discussed in the ether, but I don't know. But Spalding, he got his master's degree from Moore's Indian Charity School, and he studied Oriental, or what they called Oriental, but it was Middle Eastern languages. And Ethan Smith studied at the same school. Again, Hiram studied there too. So maybe Hiram brought a map. I don't think we've seen that in the library. But the second point here is that Jershon is a Hebrew word, and it's used correctly in the Book of Mormon. And so it looks like somebody, if this was intentional, it looks like the author of the Book of Mormon might have known Hebrew. And Spalding studied Hebrew, of course, at Dartmouth College again. So I think that points to some complexity that's hard to explain with a sole author model. Then we have early modern English, and we're really completely off the wall stuff too. You've got the Imadi period of 1300 to 1500. So this is 300 to 500 years before the Book of Mormon was put together. And there's phrases from this time period which show up in the Book of Mormon. And Stanford Carmack has a lot of different articles and analyzing a lot of different things. In the full textual analysis presentation, I go through 4. I'll just go through the personal relative pronoun one here. So if you look at this chart, you can see that, first off, a little context. In the early modern English period, when you're describing a group of people that went somewhere, or who went somewhere, or which went somewhere, you can use those interchangeably. And we actually do that a little bit today even, but it's interesting to know what the Bible uses. The Bible uses the word that 86% of the time. So very clear preference for that in the biblical period. In the Book of Mormon period, the Book of Mormon primarily uses which, but in the time period, in Joseph's writing, he uses who exclusively. And when they revised the Book of Mormon, they changed almost every single instance of which to who. So to me, this just looks like the author of the Book of Mormon has a different preference for the personal relative pronoun than Joseph does. Why would he be shifting his use there? And again, this is a word that might be an artifact of the voice. I don't know. I think a lot more study could be done in relation to not just saying, hey, there's archaic use in the Book of Mormon, so it's archaic. That's kind of what Stanford Carmack is doing. I think you could take all of his work and apply it to the 3-voice framework and try to see what it shows you there. All right, Book of Mormon includes Native American life references. So Dr. Thomas Murphy is an expert in 19th century Native American studies. And so he's recognized in the Book of Mormon personal names, place names, organizational structures, specific leaders who have analog to real people, real Native Americans in the Book of Mormon. And so I would just note that the author of the Book of Mormon had a pretty good understanding of Native American life. Richard Bushman in Rough Stone Rolling states that the window of interest for Native Americans in Joseph's day and location had passed. And so he doesn't particularly find a reason why Joseph would be that interested in Native American life. Now, obviously, people in that day and time had some level of interest in Native American life, but to have specific parallels to organizational structures and leaders, specific leaders and person names, that seems to be a little bit of a deeper understanding. And I don't think there's any evidence that Joseph had a particular interest in, diving into this field of study. It's important to point out, I think, that Spalding preached to the Native Americans for 10 years almost. And so he was steeped in that culture. Book of Mormon vocabulary. Brian C. Hales tested the Book of Mormon text against the reading levels on 10 different reading scales. Most of the scales put the Book of Mormon in the college range. And again, I point this out that an average is an average. So there's going to be large portions of the Book of Mormon that are above the average. And then I took some portions, I took 10 different samples, just random samples out of the Book of Mormon text. And I looked up online on this website, and I found a lot of them that were in the college range. So I think it's more reasonable to think that Rigdon and the narrative authors might have been different people based on the vocabulary differences. Okay, so now with all the information that we have learned from the wordprint, from the three-voice framework, from the textual analysis, I'm going to take a crack at explaining how I think the Book of Mormon was produced. So we've got the books across the dictation order. We have the locations because it's important to note that the Whitmers were involved. The dictation was in their house for part of this. So I think the lost pages probably would have been very similar to Mosiah through Helaman, in that you have the very clear narrator and sermon switching. I think there would have been a text, there would have been a manuscript that they were working from. Again, I'm not going to get into the dictation mechanics, but whether he was memorizing or using bullet points or reading from it or whatever, I think there was an underlying text that represented this content. And I think it was Rigdon and most likely Spalding. And so I think it's the same for the Mosiah Alma Helaman portion. The original design of the Book of Mormon, it gets a little different in 3rd Nephi, where you have Jesus coming and there's New Testament content, but I think that was still originally part of the plan. Ganesh points out that 4th Nephi and Mormon both have kind of like false endings, or endings which are repeated later on. And so he proposes, and I think it's a good idea, that this is probably the original ending of the Book of Mormon. Would have been Lehi through 4th Nephi or Mormon, and that was part of the original manuscript. So a little bit of Joseph creeping in at this point. You're having a transition from the original ending to a new ending, and marrying this thing up with the Book of Mosiah. So I think that's why you see a little bit of Joseph's wordprint showing up this early. Ether is kind of an anomaly. Ganesh calls it the Reader's Digest version of the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon. So it's an earlier version of people coming across from the older world to the new world, and engaging in all this activity. Lars Nilsson, his thoughts in working with the wordprint analysis and other analysis is that this was probably an existing text from the narrative author. I have no additional information, so I'll just say probably existing text. Again, most likely the narrative author of the rest of the book, plus Rigdon and a little bit more Joseph showing up. In Moroni, you're getting new theology showing up. You have the sacrament prayers. They're thinking about starting the church and the rest of that movement that's starting to be ready to take off. So I think that Moroni probably was not in the existing text, but through kind of just the vagaries of how everything came to be, you're getting this written. And then we go into the Nephi, and Jacob. Now they're in the Whitmer home. You have the interaction with the Whitmers. You have the filler material. You have Joseph either using the text again and trying to make it sound different, or you have him trying to recall what he had dictated a year ago, or probably a year at that point, and working from memory. So at this point, I think it's pretty much just Rigdon and Joseph. And Joseph, unless they kept the narrative text and he's just rewording it to sound differently. And then you have the small books where they're just trying to fill in the gap that their poor math led them to, or their inability to create content, and they need more content to get to Mosiah. Okay, so that's the textual analysis section. Now we have the Joseph section, and I'm going to condense Joseph's entire life down into just a few slides here because I knew that we'd probably go long here. So here's kind of the content. All right, so Joseph's prep years. What was Joseph doing before the Book of Mormon was dictated? Joseph had a smattering of education. That's John Turner's words. Total years of education, 7 at most. That's the gentleman who wrote the book, whose name I always stumble on. The book about the dictation methods. How it's called Visions in a Seer Stone.
William Davis.
Yeah, William Davis, thanks. So William Davis puts it at 7. Other authors a little bit less, but he definitely had some formal education. He could write and dictate a well-worded letter, despite what Emma said. Some of the letters were a little tough to read, so I see your point, but he could write a letter for sure. His mother said that he was the least inclined of the Smiths to reading. I would just say, do you have to read to write a book? He was not disciplined academically. That's, again, John Turner's description. His brother Hiram was an academic. He went to this Dartmouth College. And there's really interesting. I thought this was extremely fascinating and compelling. And then I thought, well, how old was Joseph during this time period? Yeah. Joseph was quite young at this time period. So he was probably they discussed some topics of interest and all that kind of thing. But I doubt that Joseph was preparing the Book of Mormon at this age. Joseph attended Methodist revivals and debate clubs. So his interaction with the academic world was kind of in a social context as well. And of course, he studied the Bible. I think everybody was at this time and place. John Turner says Joseph was precocious and curious, but he would never become a scholar, and he rarely devoted himself to any subject for very long. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was pretty important to note about trying to figure out who wrote a book. During the Book of Mormon prep years, Joseph claimed the first vision and annual visits by the angel Moroni, and that these were, and that he was told he was going to start a church and produce scripture. I started digging in all the history. There's zero that in the time period that Joseph was doing any of this preparation. It's all later. During these years, what was Joseph doing? He was actually, doing manual labor. His family was trying to desperately save their farm, and he was engaged in day labor. He was also engaged in magic and treasure digging. He had outstanding leadership skills. He was in his young teen. As a 15, 16-year-old, he was leading the treasure digs. He was in the house chilling out while the rest of the team was digging for treasure, because he could convince them that he could see in his stone, in his hat, where the treasure was located, and he gave them direction. And so he was very learned in these kind of folk magic arts. So again, there's nothing in the record before 1828 that he was planning, preparing, intending to write a book. And this is his family. This is everybody. And so I'll just point out briefly that the first vision and the angel Moroni stories, there's some really crazy stuff that you can get into if you want to, if we dive into that later. All right. There's even digging up graves. So there's some really wacky stuff. Joseph is unfamiliar with the Book of Mormon and never uses it. So after he published it, he just walked away from it. He only promoted the fact that, hey, I produced it. He's like, don't worry about what's inside the book. Just, isn't that really awesome that I dictated this book in 3 months? He put the original in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house. He said, I had trouble enough with this thing. I would say I had enough trouble, but he said I had trouble enough. So again, word prints vary. So again, it's like it was written by somebody else, or the content came from somebody else. Alexander Campbell in 1831. This is his first meeting with Rigdon. So Joseph interacted with the Campbells for many, many, many years, and they were friends and they partnered and they were colleagues. When he first met Rigdon, would somebody read what Alexander Campbell claims Rigdon said? I think this is fascinating.
For Joseph to be proved a liar or say himself that he never found the Book of Mormon as he had reported it, still he, Rigdon, would believe it, and believe that all who did not believe it shall be damned.
All right. So to me, that's showing that Rigdon, he's a little unsure that Joseph's going to stick with the story. That's kind of how I read that statement. Rigdon, however, defended the Book of Mormon from beginning to end until his death. And he claimed it was supposed to form and govern the millennial church. So Rigdon was all in on the Book of Mormon. And we'll get into his wife, Phoebe. His wife was later made a prophetess and part of the first presidency. And Sidney asked her to produce some theological kind of Sunday school content. And her very first topic was the Book of Mormon. So they were all in on the Book of Mormon, the Rigdons.
I even had a theory that Phoebe might have had some authorship. I was thinking, I wonder if there's a word study with Phoebe. I was really into Phoebe for a while there, studying her. Once I read some of the things that she'd written and the scripture, I was like, they never look at the women, right? They never look at them as being a driving force. So I don't know. I'm also a conspiracy theorist.
Okay, well, she was an amazing woman for sure, and we'll get into just a brief description of her story as well. Okay, so I found it really interesting to think about how the biographers. So we'll look at John Turner, Bushman, and Dan Vogel. How do they explain that decision of Joseph to pivot from looking in his hat in the seer stone and leading treasure digs to deciding to write the Book of Mormon? And so here's what they say. Does anybody want to take a crack at reading that first one?
I can read the first one. This is from Turner's book. It's such a bad idea. If you could brainstorm with Joseph on how to make a living, publishing the Book of Mormon would not be high on the list of how to pull it off. It's just an incredible gamble. And he took that from Mormon Stories podcast. So that's interesting.
Sorry for I had a repeat on the word high there.
Yeah, it's okay.
So Turner's just like, I have no idea, basically.
Yeah.
Somebody want to take a crack at Bushman's explanation?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Lucy had no premonitions of such a future as a seer, a translator, and apostle for her son. Judging from later accounts by the Smiths' neighbors, Joseph's religious struggles were unknown in the village. The publication of the Book of Mormon surprised everyone. The villagers had no idea that the nondescript farm boy who occasionally appeared in town to buy a paper for his father had any ambition or religious character. The townspeople thought of the family as treasure seekers, not eager Christians.
So I was looking in his book to see if I could figure out what he thought about this decision, and that's the closest I can get to basically hands in the air, no idea. Vogel is very different though, and somebody want to take a crack at that one? So Dan Vogel was explaining his theory. John DeLynn was interviewing Vogel, and DeLynn was really pushing him on this point.
Joseph, a narcissist, believed end of world was coming, wanted to create a theocracy in the West to solve crisis in America, solve civilization's theological debates, lead to creation of a New Jerusalem or Zion community around him. As far as military aspect, would lead to converting Lamanites to marshal them in his coming army. Book would also serve as miracle for charismatic prophet for followers and source of charisma, replacing seerstone.
And sorry, that's about 10 minutes of text or of discussion from Vogel that I'm just capturing kind of the bullet points on. So Vogel, I just found this to be a really interesting point, really insightful. Since we can't make any sense of why Joseph would write the Book of Mormon, why don't we look inside the Book of Mormon and see what that Book of Mormon says its mission is? So what does the Book of Mormon's claim? Vogel has his own kind of description of it there, but what does the Book of Mormon actually claim? It's a book of scripture from ancient America to govern through the millennium. It's a restoration of the ancient gospel. It describes the creation of a new church. This is part of the church, but I think it's important to call it separately a renewal of spiritual gifts. This is one of the topics that was being highly debated at the time, and authority. Conversion of the Lamanites and the Jews and the Gentiles. Creation of a Zion and a New Jerusalem using a communitarian model. Judgment of the Wicked in Preparation for the Second Coming of Jesus and the Millennium. So that's a pretty big project. I'm going to refer to this as a 7-point project. So the Book of Mormon says this is the mission of the Book of Mormon. So whoever's writing the Book of Mormon had a pretty big vision in mind. And that's what I'm taking from Vogel. And I think it's a good point, and I'm going to leverage that. So who had the vision, persistence, confidence to engage in that 7-point project? So Dehlin, here's how he reacted. He was like, Joseph was 22 years old, just busted for treasure digging in the glass-looking trial, down on his luck, almost thrown in jail, newly eloped with an angry in-laws, uncertain of his future. That's the guy who's ready to engage in a 7-point project. Again, there's nothing in the historical record of Joseph having any intention, planning, persistence, confidence, and actually not even just in the time frame. His family members never say, yeah, that Joseph was really, he would always go and work on this thing what was he doing? There's none of that. Everybody is just shocked that the Book of Mormon comes just out of the blue. So it's not just a historical record before the production of the Book of Mormon. In later tellings, nothing. The record is replete that this is precisely what Rigdon's training, trajectory, and mindset was before the publication of the Book of Mormon and throughout his life. And the Times and Seasons has this just amazing article. The way Sidney wrote is just crazy. So he had, in this time frame, in the 1820s, when the Book of Mormon is supposedly being produced by Joseph under the sole author theory, what was Rigdon doing? He was converting people. He was building, creating congregations, having great success. Can I have somebody try to read this? This is Rigdon in third person, which speaks to kind of his uniqueness. But if you could kind of get through this, it's kind of hard to read because it's third person. But if somebody would take a crack at this.
I can try. He's writing about himself then?
Yes.
I love it. His fame as an orator and deep reasoner in the scriptures continued to spread far and wide, and he soon gained a popularity and an elevation which has fallen to the lot of but few. Consequently, thousands flocked to hear his eloquent discourses. My goodness. No longer did he follow the old beaten track, which had been traveled for ages by the religious world, but he dared to enter upon new grounds, threw new light on the sacred volume, particularly those prophecies which so deeply interest this generation and which have been entirely overlooked or mystified by the religious world, cleared up scriptures which had been heretofore appeared inexplicable, and delighted his astonished audience with things new and old. He proved to a demonstration of literal fulfillment of prophecy, the gathering of Israel in the last days to their ancient inheritances with their ultimate splendor and glory, the situation of the world at the coming of the Son of Man, the judgments which Almighty God would pour out upon the ungodly prior to that event, and the reign of Christ with his saints on the earth in the millennium. This is from the Times and Seasons. So, wow, he seems to have the fourfold mission down.
Yeah. So does it look like Sidney had the 7-point project in mind? Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about Rigdon then. Let's pivot into him. There's his background, his evolution as a minister in the disciples movement or restorationist movement or reform movement or Campbellism. You have his actual theology. And then you have how he shows up in the church once he joins Mormonism. So he was born near Pittsburgh, as I mentioned. Books, loved books. He would go get books anywhere he could. And he had an impressive memory, could recall everything he read. He suffered an injury at the age of 7. He fell off a horse and his foot got caught in the stirrup and he got dragged along a little bit. So he had a head injury. His brother became a doctor and described him as having, as his injury affecting not his cognitive capabilities, not his intelligence, but his emotional stability. And then Van Wagener in this biography spoke with a psychologist who thought he undoubtedly had some sort of mood or bipolar disorder. And this is important. This is actually part of the story. What you just read, Rebecca, illustrates, I think, that messianic complex almost, that feeling that I've been called of God to do this important thing. And he does this important thing in an excessive and obsessive manner. The subtitle of his biography is A Portrait of Religious Excess. So Rigdon, religion was in the family. He had three cousins and his brother-in-law were all Baptist ministers. He joined a congregation there in Pittsburgh, and shortly after he joined, this speaks to his confidence, he was ready to try and challenge the minister and take over the congregation. He was talked down. He was convinced to engage in an apprenticeship with a reverend in a nearby town. That lasted all of 6 months, and then he was off doing his own thing. So in the home of this the person, his apprentice, his mentor, he called it a perfect paradise of books and intellectual companionship. And he also engaged in an extensive self-improvement course in reading and memorizing extensive portions of the Bible. Just put a flag on perfect paradise. What's Joseph's perfect paradise? What's Sidney's perfect paradise? Books. Rigdon was allowed to preach in congregations after he left, even before he became ordained a minister. And then he moved to Mentor, Ohio, where he met Phoebe. So this is where Phoebe comes into the story. Sidney had throughout his life but one wife, and they had 12 children. And in his later church, he gave women equal status. They were in the first presidency, and she was a prophetess. So props to Phoebe. I really agree with Rebecca here that she was probably a remarkable woman. And boy, she had the patience of a saint because of their life story, but also dealing with his mental illness. Okay, so we're going to take one slide and get from the beginning to the end of his Campbellite portion to Mormonism. So he started preaching, and he was drawn to the Restorationist movement. So he was continually having challenges of staying within kind of the normal Baptist movement. Same for the Campbells and Walter Scott, who formed Campbellism. So he interacted with them. He was persuaded by them. And then he was very successful, as I mentioned. He had experience converting people and creating congregations. He leveraged Scott's ideas on the millennium. He was called a millenarian of the first water by Campbell. He was attracted to communalism. He created an experiment with Lyman White and Isaac Morley on their farm in Kirtland. And this was before Mormonism. In 1830, he was offered a full-time position in Mentor. This is a beautiful town. President Garfield came from Mentor. Big, beautiful homes along the, not far from the Erie Lake Erie. They had a lot of poverty in their lives, and this was a privileged position that he was offered. And so he walked away from the best opportunity to go into Mormonism. Okay, so just pause this if you want to look at all the different elements of the theology that was Rigdon's theology that are very close to Mormon theology at the time that he joins the church and show up in the Book of Mormon. Okay, and don't just take my word for it. The guy who created the title slide here, William Whitsett, his biography is called Sidney Rigdon, the real founder of Mormonism. Take it from someone with a doctorate in divinity and the letter of laws, and take it from somebody who was a professor of a theological seminary. So he really understood the whole disciple movement and what that meant in terms of looking at the theology of the disciples in the Book of Mormon. So he says the sacred texts of Book of Mormonism speak a plain and unvarnished story. They seem to point to Sidney Rigdon as the real founder of Mormon theology. No other person could have been the author of the religious portions of the Book of Mormon. He supplies the only key to a proper comprehension of the subject. The sources whence Mormon belief was borrowed are neither very various nor very far to seek. Somebody want to take the last part of that?
I can take it. The Book of Mormon copies the tenets of the disciples with singular fidelity and shows that Mormonism was devised to promote what he, Rigdon, considered the best interests of the body of Christians by carrying their doctrines and practices to a point where he fancied they should be consistent and irresistible. Mormonism was originally designed to be an improvement upon the theology and polity of the disciples, both in its theology and history. therefore are insoluble mysteries without constant reference to Mr. Rigdon and to them, the disciples.
And so I would just point out in this time frame, Joseph is just confused theologically. I think he's trying to join the Methodists with Emma and her family. So there's no evidence that Joseph had a fixed theology. He didn't have a fixed core. And, I think that helps explain, kind of where he was at the time. Okay, so Sidney joins a church. The Book of Mormon looks like it's written by somebody like Rigdon. Both he and Parley Pratt had miraculous conversion stories just months apart. They're later retold in ways that seem like they're massaging the story to make it more credible. And obviously Rigdon is pointed out as he's fingered as the author of the Book of Mormon right away. So they kind of go back and retell the conversion story to make it sound like, oh, he took his time. He wasn't really into this thing for a while, and then he eventually came around once he had this, I think, an angelic vision. Immediately, so he joins the church. He immediately goes to New York to meet Joseph, and he's immediately made co-leader of the church. He's receiving revelations and actively helping develop scripture with Joseph. There's a lot of quotes from David Whitmer to this point. I stumbled on this one reading Ganesh's book. He references the source here from Warren Parrish for something different, but I thought, oh, well, that's weird. And I went and looked at it. And here's Warren Parrish explaining all of his complaints about Joseph and Sidney in Kirtland after the bank has failed. Somebody burns down the printing press, which was supposed to be collateral for people collecting on their bad debts and other grievances that he had. He was upset that they had fled town. So his reference here is about his grievances, but in the telling of those grievances, you see how he thinks about Joseph and Sidney. So here's Warren Parrish. I have taken the liberty to send a synopsis of some of the leading features of the characters of Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, who are the styled leaders of the Mormon Church. So he just has them completely equivalent. I have for several years been a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, commonly called Mormons, belonging to the quorum of 70 high priests, and an intimate acquaintance of Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, the Mormon prophets. The recent outrage here committed, viz., the burning of the printing establishment, I have no doubt was nothing more nor less than carrying into effect Smith and Rigdon's last revelation. So they're getting revelations together. A well-grounded conviction of this fact was evidently one reason why Smith and Rigdon obtained a revelation to abscond. And it was countersigned or co-signed by apostles Luke Johnson here and then John Boynton at the bottom, as well as two presidents of the 70. So I just found it very interesting that he's not trying to make the point that, hey, these two guys are equal partners. He's complaining about other things, but you see how he understands, and it's just common knowledge that they are just totally joined at the hip on everything. So they worked together on the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible right away. Joseph had already started, but Sidney comes in and rewrites the first 7 chapters, and then they write the rest. Campbell had his own version of the so who comes up with the idea of changing the Bible, creating their own translation of the Bible? Well, Campbell had his own version of the Bible, and so that was not unique to something Rigdon would have been thinking about. And one of his sons was named Wycliffe, who translated the Bible to English from the Vulgate. Book of Moses is a collaboration between Joseph and Rigdon. It teaches this conversion sequence that Rigdon had that shows up in the Book of Mormon right when he learned about it from Walter Scott, and the phrase children of men. So it looks like there's a pretty heavy fingerprint of Rigdon in the Book of Moses. Book of Commandments, and then the rewriting the D&C. Could somebody read what Whitmer's claim? This David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon.
Rigdon would expound the Old Testament scriptures of the Bible and Book of Mormon in his way to Joseph concerning the priesthood, high priest, etc., and would persuade brother Joseph to inquire of the Lord about this doctrine and that doctrine. And of course, a revelation will always come just as they desired it.
Okay, so this is again the finger of the Lord. David Whitmer claims it's Sidney, not Joseph. And then for the sake of time, I'll kind of skip this, but Bushman says the same thing. The family has no idea that Joseph had this capability to produce this wonderful scripture. And that's beyond just scripture. It's doctrine, ritual, organizational structure. The doctrine in the D&C, the Lectures on Faith, was written by Rigdon. He created the School of the Prophets, basically. He drove the development of the priesthood and its offices, according to Whitmer. Shields and Van Wagner both say that the temple ritual in Kirtland was Rigdon's that he was driving that. We mentioned the communalism already. Behind the change of the name of the church, formation of the Danites in Missouri in 1838. And Rigdon drove the establishment of Zion in Missouri, Kirtland, Missouri again. And then Rigdon, when the others were still in the Liberty Jail, he was out early. He was trying to find lands in Nauvoo and get things going. After Joseph's death and Sidney created his own church, he tried 3 more times in Pennsylvania, Attica, Iowa, and the Red River Valley in Manitoba. He concluded at the very end that the problem was the United States. So we had to get out of the United States to establish Zion. Millenarian of the First Water, I mentioned that already. So where do we place a collaboration on the spectrum between Joseph and Sidney were equal partners, and you have a ventriloquist with a mannequin, and Sidney's just pulling the strings? An interesting question to think about.
When I look at this list, it seems like the only unique doctrine that Joseph Smith came up with was polygamy. Because Sidney was not a polygamist, right? He was not.
Yeah, that's on the next slide.
Yeah.
I got a slide for that one. Okay, so it's not just that they came up with that Sidney and Joseph were joined at the hip in all these different activities. It's that so much of it came in the first year.
Right.
The Book of Mormon is published, the church is established. Sidney waits 6 months and he joins. And then they continue the JST. They published the Book of Moses. They've got 50 sections of the D&C done. In February, so this is literally a month after he meets Rigdon, they're moving to Kirtland. And this is to your point earlier, Brandon, or Landon. Landon. And then in June, they're heading off to Jackson County, Missouri to start a mission to the Lamanites. And they're dedicating Missouri for Zion and New Jerusalem. They're buying land for the temple. All this stuff going on. So somebody had a pent-up wellspring of ideas. This is like a band that their first album contains years of preparation, and it's awesome. And then they can't repeat it. So let's remove the Book of Mormon and see the contrast here. So think about this as a page in history. Turn the page backwards to 1828, 1829. What does Joseph's history look like? He's just some random kid who's recently married, who's bumbling in religion. And let's now think about the page for Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon is a successful Campbellite minister, Reformed minister. He's got his own theology worked out. He's successful in creating congregations and converting people. How does that history most look congruent? That's what I would point out here. And we've talked about the fact that Brigham took Sidney out of the record. So again, the reason why this is important is that you really overestimate his capabilities, I think. And this is what Dallin Oaks, the president of the church right now, said a few years ago. In his life, Joseph Smith accomplished more than any mortal man could have accomplished in so short a time. It is the only possible explanation is heavenly help. So all these miraculous things required miracles, basically. Well, I think that's why it's important to understand who actually was the founder. All right, so now the last section, we'll compare the two. And again, I've skipped a lot of the content. But I think it's important to think about what you're saying, Rebecca. What's the one thing Joseph definitely did? So in Nauvoo, Rigdon contracted malaria. Between this and his mental condition, he was often confined to his room, to his bed. He was out of the way. He was less involved in the daily operations. So it's unclear to me of all these things that we think about as the Nauvoo doctrine that was layered onto the 7-point project. Where did that come from? Some of it, I think, was started in the mind of Rigdon as well, because it's in the Book of Abraham, which was early. The Relief Society was an idea of the women. Joseph co-opted it at times. And then you've got these other elements, plural marriage. You have the temple endowment, which is leveraging the Masonic ritual, which is a secret ritual. You have the second anointing, which is kind of a carrot for, going along. Rigdon opposed polygamy, as did the Book of Mormon. His grandson, this is Nancy Rigdon, who Joseph proposed marriage to. This is her son. He basically says Sidney knew of the practice, but he couldn't fight it because it only made things worse, basically. Okay, a word about the size of the conspiracy. A lot of the critics of my theory would say, oh, you've got all these people that are in the conspiracy and they would have had to keep a secret. Sidney and Joseph and Oliver and Emma and Martin Harris. I think it really requires only Joseph and Sidney. And not today, but there is evidence that we could talk about that Joseph was hiding problems in the text from Cowdery. So pretty clear to me that Cowdery was not in the conspiracy. And then they retained that relationship, like you said, Landon, at the beginning. Joseph fired everybody except for Rigdon. There was something special about that relationship. And it wasn't kept secret. Rigdon's grandson said that, yeah, everybody knew that Sidney wrote the Book of Mormon in the family. They wouldn't talk about it, but they said that. And then to the point about what's in the archives, there's 3 critical points in the Rigdon biography where Van Wagner was not allowed access to what was in the archives. And that's after Sidney and Joseph had the rift where Joseph proposed polygamy to Nancy Rigdon, Sidney's daughter. After Joseph died, Sidney and Brigham were fighting for control of the church. There was a meeting that those are not made public. And then when Rigdon was being excommunicated, so I think Rigdon was threatening the church in these 3 points, threatening Joseph and the church in these 3 points. It could have been polygamy, but I think it might have also been Rigdon's role in the Book of Mormon. Why did Rigdon need Joseph? Rigdon obviously could have written something like the Book of Mormon. So it was necessary to have the scripture come forth in this miraculous fashion. And this argument has been used for a long time. Joseph had a demonstrated ability to convince people of miracles and to memorize. Why did Joseph need Rigdon? This was exactly the kind of thing that would have played to his personality, his sense of adventure and risk. And in all the interviews with John DeLynn, John Turner, you kind of see this theme show up a lot. So what was Rigdon's mission? His mission was laser aligned with the Book of Mormon mission. He basically checks off all the boxes. And here's some of the specifics of Rigdon, where they relate back to the mission. And then in contrast, what was Joseph's mission? So when Joseph had control and Rigdon was out of the way, what did he do? He went for polygamy. And if you thought that going for polygamy was necessary for restoration, which Sidney did, I think you could just have a ceiling like you have with the prophet of the church today. Oakes has a deceased wife who he's sealed to and his current wife. You could have done it that way if you were a kind, loving God, knowing that this was not acceptable in this day and time. Joseph's version reflects his personality, seeker of thrills, excitement, risky behavior. He was at great risk of being extradited to Missouri, of the church falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very high risk time in his life. But he instigates dozens of secret marriages. He uses manipulation. He engages in polyandry, which I think is leveraging power against these are men that he's close with, and their daughters, and sometimes their wives, or their wives in this case, mother-daughter pairs, sister pairs, young teens. I think this plays to his personality, that he was seeking risk. I think the practices that we see are tied to polygamy, that he leveraged the secrecy of the temple ceremony, he leveraged the Relief Society to promote secrecy. And this is exactly what John Turner and John DeLynn are in the 30th and 31st episode of the biography. They're talking about this very thing. Calling election made sure was really a great way to reward compliance for engaging in polygamy. And there was public shaming for those that opposed it. And a lot of people think that when they had a little bit of a falling out, it was because Joseph proposed to Nancy Rigdon. But Van Wagner's impression is that it's because Joseph took his eye off the ball and he lost focus. So when we summarize all the different types of evidence, the Spalding theory, the old theory, I think is 50-50. If you look at all the different elements of the theory, you can come out of that and say, there's good evidence, but you can criticize it too. The 3-voice model, I think, is very important, and it leans towards establishing multiple authors. as does the word print studies, the textual analysis, and looking at the life of Joseph. I think it plays into the idea that he's not the sole author. And I think when you look at Rigdon, Joseph is one of the worst candidates. Rigdon is the perfect candidate. You couldn't have AI build a better candidate than Rigdon. His background, his mental illness, his obsession, I think it all plays into him being a really good candidate. So I conclude the thesis is correct because there's no reasonable explanation I can come up with that anybody's proposed today on the split between narrator and sermon being the vector that everything splits on. There's no explanation for Joseph's ability to date. John, you alluded a little bit to how this worked in the Greek plays and so on. Word prints show more than one author, and the LDS authored word print studies never consider Rigdon. They always avoid him like a plague. The Rigdon theory explains all these difficult parts of history. The Book of Mormon isn't simply a story. It's not a novel. It brings along with it this larger mission. It's writing a book generally takes time and focus and intent and capability and writing and rewriting and editing. And there would have been some print on the history. His family would have claimed something about this, I think, and there's just nothing there. And why Joseph thought to create a scripture and start a movement. Joseph's lack of suitability for all of this. Why the Book of Mormon and Book of Commandments command Joseph not to do anything more than dictate. It explains the Hebrew, the Imadi, the native culture, the Appalachian elements in the Book of Mormon. It explains the complex narration, the theological elements, the character switching, the vocabulary, the higher vocabulary than Joseph's. It explains some of the anomalies in the lost pages that are redictated. The complex naming structure that Lars Nielsen gets into in one of your podcast episodes on Mormonish, a very good episode. Why Joseph abandons the content and only points out how great the dictation was. It explains Rigdon's ascension and co-leadership and leading all the academic side of the work and why they never split, Joseph and Sidney. It explains why anybody thought creating a Zion on earth would succeed, especially after they failed multiple times. That was a question that DeLynn had for Turner. Who thought this was a reasonable idea to go to Missouri after it failed already and then go to Nauvoo and do the same thing? Well, it took somebody a little bit crazy, I think. And why the Book of Abraham differs so remarkably from the Book of Mormon project. Book of Abraham did not have the work of Rigdon in it. And why the Rigdon movement removed Sidney from Mormonism, continuing to today. So, Rebecca, Landon, co-host John, thank you. Everybody out there, hit like and subscribe, donate.
He's doing our ending, isn't he? So back up.
All right.
I do.
Thank you.
I do have to go. I have something for you, Patrick.
Yes.
Actually, I'd like to do the whole Rigdon as its own podcast. Maybe Mormonish can have you back on.
Yeah, I think
the word print study was kind of its own thing, and here's a way I think that all the word print studies can be verified or falsified. Early modern English is an idiomatic form of English that shouldn't be in the Book of Mormon. It's early modern English between 1700 CE, and yet colloquialisms run throughout the Book of Mormon in early modern English. No one is speaking in early modern English colloquialisms in the milieu of Joseph Smith, right? That's about a century before him. My point is, early modern English shouldn't be in the Book of Mormon if it's an ancient text. And it shouldn't be in the Book of Mormon if Joseph Smith alone is writing it. So the question is, can we track early modern English grammar, colloquial grammar, which is embedded in the text, throughout the entire text? If it is, it's one author. If it's in the sermon portion, but not in the narrative portion, or if it's in the narrative portion, but not in the sermon portion, it could be two authors.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
Your early modern English is a way to test it.
Hmm.
And so I want a wordprint study that looks at early modern English grammar in the original and printer's manuscript. Now, note the printer was sloughing out early modern English colloquialisms as he set the press,
Yeah.
but it's still in it. If we had the original manuscript, that would be, the holy grail to do this. But we only have what, 15, 18% of the original manuscript.
Yeah.
Um, that is what you could test some of this word printing with. Do you understand?
Yeah, actually, I showed four of the studies, then I only went to one of them. One of the other four, Rob Terry picked up, and he sees it only in the sermon voice, I think is what it was. So Rob Terry actually took one of those and showed that it was mostly in the sermon and the late voice, actually. So I found that kind of interesting, but it was kind of confusing, and I thought it would take a while to get into, and I was trying to speed this thing
Oh
up
no.
since.
This is the one
Yeah.
thing I want to talk about. Maybe I've got to
Okay.
go, so maybe we can come back and do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, let's.
Okay.
Terry found early modern English embedded in the sermon and late voice, but not in the narrative voice, or at least
Yeah.
mostly. Well, no, wait. Was it partially in the narrative voice?
No, I think it was exclusive to one of the two voices and the late voice. I think it was sermon and late. And it was the did X, did go, did eat, did fast. It's that particular literary feature.
I want to
But yeah,
know that.
I think we should def and that's it's confusing and it's a lot of hard work. I tried to go into the manuscript story, and I tried to go into the sermon or the Sidney Rigdon content online and try and look for these phrases.
Have you talked to
And
Terry?
what's that?
Have you talked to Terry?
I've reached out to him and he hasn't replied. I don't know
Rebecca and
if I
Landon,
have.
you need him on your show.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so too.
No, with
yeah,
Patrick and I'd love to at least,
Yeah.
lurk in the background.
No, I
Um,
know.
yeah.
This
That would be
episode has
great.
a lot of little pieces that we can go back and dig into, and this is a huge one. You're right, John. So
Yeah,
let's put a pin in it and let's go back and do it. That's awesome. I know you have to go,
yeah,
John. So, but yeah, that's great.
well, I found this absolutely fascinating. I loved
Yeah.
it. And Patrick, that was very thorough and very well documented. There's several things I'd like to address, but I do have to go. So I can go and you guys can keep
We'll
going. But
address them for you, John. So
um, I would be very interested in what Terry found with the early modern English or what any of the word print studies did, because, that to me is graffiti.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And so that's what I want to track. And anyway, excellent idea for a
Yeah.
podcast, Rebecca and Landon.
Yep, let's look at that. That'd be fantastic. Well, thanks, John, for joining us as you could. And we will definitely, I think there's several different things we could explore in this that we'd love to have you back on. So we'll say
All
goodbye to
right.
you.
yeah.
Go to your day.
Thank you.
It was
See you, Patrick.
fantastic.
Yeah,
That's
see you,
right.
John. Thanks.
I know, like you said, Patrick, this is like a 7 podcast series, and you kind of synthesized it all right here, which is fantastic. And we know historians well versed in Mormonism who say, yes, Sidney Rigdon. I mean, they go along with what you're saying.
Okay.
I think that's out there. What I look forward to someday on AI, perhaps, is to somehow explain that connection prior to Sidney arriving on the porch. A lot of people say Parley P. Pratt. There's a lot of speculation there, but that's the one thing that at this point nobody can pinpoint. You can show all this other stuff, but nobody can pinpoint that. So I look forward to AI. Just put in both their lives and say, show how this happens. Where are the connections? What do you think, Landon?
Yeah, I think that'll be hard to find because
Yeah.
I think most of the information about Pratt and I think he was trying to keep it hidden. So
Oh,
if you're
yeah.
trying to keep it hidden in the 1830s, 200
Yeah.
years later, it's going to be really hard to find. But
Yeah. And Brigham probably
uh,
tried to hide it too. I mean, that's the thing. I think that was the connection that could not be shown if it existed. Because
in fact, I believe I read that he had all of his
Yeah.
papers burned when
Yep.
he died,
Yeah.
which means we lost a whole bunch of information that would have been helpful. And why would you ask that all of your papers be burned? That seems rather odd
Well,
that
it
you
sounds
would
out of
ask
character
that.
for him. Look how he's writing about himself in the third person. He would
Yeah.
want everything to go forward, but
It-
maybe protecting the movement. I don't know. But
yeah.
I love how you synthesized everything here. And we've had multiple podcasts on, different pieces of this topic. But yeah, the word analysis is super fascinating. And we absolutely need to dig into that. And I love John's ideas. So I think we can definitely come back and do that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And what are the chances that two guys this smart were companions?
Yeah, that's what I think. Too bad you guys didn't start talking about this in these, long car rides. This scholarship could be 30 years old, right? So,
Maybe on the next episode, I'll bring in some pictures of John and I from that
oh
trip.
my gosh,
It'd be
I would
fun.
love that.
Yeah.
I would love that. But yeah, no, this is amazingly thorough, and our audience should know, that we said to Patrick, well, let's cut this down, and do like an initial sort of presentation, and then we can dive back into different parts of it, because there were several different things that could almost stand alone, in this entire podcast. I think all the word synthesis and the different authorship could be, like you said, there's a lot more that you went through. There's a lot more knowledge that you have, and this just kind of gives everybody a taste of it. But you're not wrong. The Spalding Rigdon theory was it for years, and then a lot of people moved away from Spalding, but kind of took Rigdon with that. Do you agree with that, Landon? Kind of, they never kind of look at Rigdon as standalone because they discredit Spalding Rigdon together. What do you think about that, Landon?
Yeah, I think they looked at Spalding and said, "Oh, we've been able to throw that out.
Yeah, that's
Therefore, Rigdon
absurd,
couldn't
right?
be involved." And there's a lot to indict that Rigdon was part of this,
Yes.
and Patrick hit almost all of that. His background, a lot of his beliefs end up in the Book of Mormon. They shouldn't be there if it's an ancient record, and yet they're very much Campbellite 19th century thoughts. And so how did they get in there? That's a question everyone has to ask. So this is not an easy subject to discuss.
No.
Stylometry.
No, oh my
Patrick,
gosh.
you did a good job with the graphs and trying to explain how and what we were seeing with those different numbers, because I've seen this, I've seen the church apologists put these out, and they just put clusters, and they tell you, oh yeah, it proves it. And
look at that.
You made the clear distinction that, okay, it might show multiple voices, but we should be seeing dozens of voices, and we really only see 2 or 3 voices, which can be explained with a sermon and narrative being different, first person versus third person. So very well done. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
As far as the Spalding, or as far as the Rigdon, I just keep thinking as things go forward and more things are revealed, perhaps. Now I sound like Joseph Smith, right? Just wait, it'll all come to you. But no, there are major missing pieces there. And there's a lot of speculation, and we've all engaged in it. I mean, we've done podcasts on it. We've thought about it. We've read materials on it. We've had other authors on who explore it. And there's something there. I know there is. And I think it's just a matter of time. So we'll see. But thank you. Yes, your research is awesome. And we'll have you on again. This will be fun. So I'm sure the comments have been buzzing. There was a lot to take in here, a lot about, the narration and the, like you said, the stylometry, and then, just talking about Rigdon and his role in all of this, which I think it's a question mark for a lot of us. We just don't really know. So please comment and let us know what all of you think. And also please know that we are going to have future episodes with Patrick where we dive into this a little deeper and break some more things down. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to help financially support the podcast, you can always make a donation. We have links in our show notes to every show, to donor box, and we appreciate all of you guys. You allow us to keep functioning basically and keep podcasting and having amazing guests on like Patrick. So thanks, Landon, for co-hosting. That was fantastic. And thanks, Patrick, again for being on. And we will see everybody next time on Mormonish. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.